continuation of actually two discussions that the council had at retreats last year. We regrouped after we received feedback on some potential changes. And then since that time, there has also been a group of city officials, county officials, and private sector representatives that have come back with a series of recommendations. And so I'm going to have Scott Rigby share a few introductory slides regarding economic development, and Andrew Nave is going to take us forward in terms of the recommendations coming from the partnership, and then we'll circle back with some items that are involved with our economic development program and incentives that are not necessarily covered under the recommendations from the partnership and Andrew. So with that, I'll turn it over to Scott.
Thanks, Mr. Manager. Perfect. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mayor, members of council. It's truly unusual, but excited to be back. We actually started this process back in 2018, so there's been a little bit of turnover since then. But I wanted to provide a little bit of background as we kick off this discussion about economic development in Wichita, along with our partners, the Greater Wichita Partnership, and just give you a little background about who is Wichita. There's a lot of discussion about our industries. We look at our industries, we have about 190,000 employees in the workforce. Now this is just Wichita proper, this isn't our MSA. But as you can see, there's a wide spread of different institutions out there between healthcare, manufacturing, retail. The good news, we've seen a little over 7,000 additional jobs in 2019 over the 2018 numbers. Now obviously that may change in 2020 as we deal with the COVID situation, but year over year from 2018 to 2019, there was about a little over 2% increase. One thing that's interesting to note, manufacturing, which most people think of Wichita, over the last 5 years, this number of 16.3 has fluctuated from a high of about 18% down to about 15%. So just a perspective. Now, if you look at actual occupation about what people do, so you may be in the aerospace world, but you're technically management. This will break it down by who's in management, regardless of the industry. And one thing that's interesting is about 33% of our workforce is involved with management, business, or science-related type of industries. And actual production, which is your aerospace workers, your machine shops workers, is about 8.5%. So it just tells you the relative size and scope of our industry, of our economy here in Wichita. One of the questions we often get asked is, how does Wichita compare as far as growth or development or talent recruitment? These numbers about a year and a half old. We'll get some new numbers here in the coming months, but just to show a relative, our inbound migration for talent or population growth, just a relative. Now obviously Dallas-Fort Worth is much larger than Wichita, but just on every single day they add about 330 people. Omaha, which is one of our peers, adds about 29 as you go down the list. And Wichita is about 15. This doesn't take into effect outward migration. This is just thinking as companies look to hire in Wichita, not only from our existing workforce, but is there new workforce coming through the pipeline from other areas of the nation. This gives you a relative of that growth factor. Just in general, economic development is really divided into three major areas. One is big objectives such as creating jobs or growing the economy. These are tax policies. How do we get projects through the city process quicker? That can be expedited permitting, reviews, one-stop shops. The other one is oftentimes overlooked is the bigger, I'll call broader scope of projects, which is CIP-related projects such as arterial streets, freeways, highways, parks, swimming pools, quality of life initiatives, and sometimes people forget that those are direct connected to how we are able to do talent recruitment or how do we retain talent here in Wichita. So things like new libraries or pools or parks are critical to that discussion. That will continue to accelerate as we see an aggressive competition among some of our peer communities as well as nationwide for talent-rich areas. The last one is how do we work with our existing companies and future companies in specific programs such as industrial revenue bonds, not bombs, bonds, partnerships, EDX, TIF, CIDs, which we'll talk about a little bit later. here in the city, we break it down to three primary areas is we work with our partners, Greater Wichita Partnership, Kansas Global, Wichita Independent Business Association, WIBA, to work with our existing businesses, to work with them for business relationships and business retention expansion visits, as well as business leads. And then we also embed ourselves in other organizations, whether it be Chamber or Rotary, to develop those connections. So if there's an opportunity to pitch Wichita, whether an existing business or a new business, that they'll consider us. Again, these are three main areas: business attraction, which heavily is tied with Greater Wichita Partnership, what they'll talk about here briefly in a second. Business retention, just in the last year, we jumped in 2018, we were at 65 visits to last year, we added 122 visits to our existing businesses here, small and large. They provide us valuable response, as well as we deal with issues, whether it be a growth issue or whether it may be as simple an issue as, hey, the crosswalk out in front of our business is really causing us challenges. Can we improve that? Can we have safer roads? Those are things that we work with our existing businesses, as well as development assistance. So when a project comes through, they have a one-stop shop to work with versus talking to numerous people within the city, navigating that. Just some of our key initiatives in 2019, opportunity zones. I know Councilmember Johnson's been heavily involved with that. We were able to hire a Fuse fellow who's been working with us directly on that. We held a couple of public conferences. Regional Growth Plan, which Andrew with the partnership will discuss briefly, which is an update from the former blueprint for regional economic growth. Again, we talked about expanding our business retention visits. And then most recently and first, when we dealt with the impact of the 737 slowdown and shutdown, and then most recently with the COVID situation, we've been able to be partners with the community-wide group to work on how do we respond to that.
Scott,
Yes.
could you remind me for the Fuse fellow, how much longer do we have her here? When did she start?
I think that's September
Okay,
of this year.
so we've got her for quite a bit longer then.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Just some of our recent successes. I won't go into each one of these. You will see the growth or movement within the last few years. You'll see some of our bigger projects, Nashker Park, which just finished up. We look forward to when we can actually get out there as a community and celebrate that. But already, if you go out there today, you'll still see people exercising, do different activities. That has really spurred a lot of interest in and around that area. I know Intrust Bank's excited to have that as their new front door. You'll see the new baseball stadium. It's ready and able to go as soon as we get the green light from baseball and our partners. And then just to the north of that is about $55 million worth of development happening between the EPC group, which the first phase will finish out here in October this year. Next to that is the Hutton headquarters, which is about another $5 million project that'll finish up in October as well. And then the TGC new hotel that'll open usually the first of 2021. So already within that Delano district, we're seeing investment moving forward. With that, I'm going to pause and introduce Andrew Nave with the partnership, Greater Wichita Partnership. He's Executive Vice President. He'll talk a little about the recent work that's been going on in the last 12 to 18 months. Andrew.
Thank you, Mayor, members of the council and manager for the time to talk a little bit about economic development. Jeff Floor is joining me on the call-in and is going to be jumping in here as well. So we appreciate the time to update you on just a little bit of our work, but then also talk about some of the work that the Strategic Advisory Team, a committee of the partnership, has been working on. Brian has participated in that effort as well, and we have some recommendations for you all as you guys consider updating your economic development guidelines. So with that, I'm going to start off the presentation with, we had a good suggestion to maybe highlight maybe a new prospect and project that we are working towards. We don't often share a lot of our work. A lot of the work that we do on behalf of the community and with you all is somewhat behind the scenes, but we had an opportunity to, in this moment of the COVID crisis, our community is crying out for certainly good news and new economic opportunities. And we saw one on the horizon that we thought our community was well positioned for with the workforce that we have, with the geography and the central location that we have. and certainly with the business climate that we have. So we put together a package for Tesla. Tesla has been out in the community and out on social media with a new Cybertruck factory that they are looking to produce and develop, and have made news over the last year plus about that. And so we decided to start to engage in that conversation and make sure that they were aware of the greater Wichita region and our community and the advantages that we have. So definitely an unorthodox project, because there's not a lot out there. It's not a formal site selection process. You have a CEO, Elon Musk, who's communicated about his interest in finding the right location. And so a number of communities across the country have expressed an interest. We decided to express an interest and really get his attention with, we think, a pretty innovative video that speaks about our community's advantages. So I'm going to pull that up and share that. We had it already teed up on the website, so let me restart that and share with you our Tesla Cybertruck video.
You need a centrally located site, and the greater Wichita region has the best. Everything a Cybertruck Gigafactory needs. 800 acres and access to 2 Class 1 railroads.
800 acres?
That's right, 800 acres. We'll also throw in the #1 manufacturing skilled workforce in the nation.
Whoa, thanks, Wichita.
And that's not all. We have great ice cream, cute dogs, and a passion for space. This guy loves us, and we think you will too. Incentives for Gigafactory included, some assembly required.
Now, a little unique and unorthodox, we grant you. Oh, I want to switch back here. Unorthodox, we grant you, but our marketing team, who I'm very proud of, does a great job of zeroing in and tailoring their messages to our audience. And without going into a lot of the details and taking a lot of time away from this presentation, we've done extensive research on the company, on their executive leadership, and some of the things that are important to them. And so some of the maybe unique aspects of that video that we normally wouldn't see in a economic development brochure that were brought out were really a result of zeroing in on our client and who we think are the decision makers and what's important to them and how to get their attention. This style of this video is really in kind of that 70s Saturday morning cartoon kind of feel to it, and it's intentionally kind of kitschy like that to kind of drive attention and drive traffic, which it's certainly done that over the last week. So happy to talk more about that or to kind of get into our presentation if there's any questions or thoughts. Mayor?
Yeah, I've gotten some feedback about the campaign. I just was wondering, the 70s theme, the NASA tie-in, is there, you said you guys did research, is there something that I can, some research reasoning why you guys went that route instead of a more modern?
Yeah, it was
just the humor, or
absolutely.
I've had people ask me about it, and they think it's coming from us, and I don't know,
Yeah.
I'm not sure what the thought was behind it. So
Sure, absolutely. No, it was produced by the Greater Wichita Partnership team. It was internally developed, and our team produced it and executed it in an extremely short amount of time. But as much as I can say is that it is tailored to who we think the decision makers are, because again, this isn't a formal project or a formal process. There's not a lot of clear line of sight as to exactly what the process is. So we're absolutely kind of taking some stabs at it to a degree, but we feel very confident about the messages that we've delivered. And it is intentionally meant to be unique and a little bit different and a conversation starter for sure.
okay.
Other thoughts? Well, with that, I think we're going to kind of pivot to a conversation about, and briefly, there's a number of things that we've been working on with the Greater Wichita Partnership, one of which is in close connection with your staff and the city leadership and the county leadership on economic recovery as a result of the COVID crisis that we all find ourselves in. So I'm going to turn it over to Jeff Floor to kind of kick off a recovery document that we've been a part of with a number of other groups, and then I'll kind of walk through pieces of it, and then we'll transition to the rest of our discussion. So Jeff?
It's great to be able to join you. I'm actually looking at the back of you right now, so I'll want to walk through in the back corner. So thank you, Brian. Becky, good to see you. Wish I could be there in person, but I understand with the number of folks that can be in the room, so I was glad to be able to join you just to give you a highlight or an overview of this document, which I understand you have in front of you as far as the regional economic recovery document. Scott mentioned earlier in January where we initiated the aerospace task force to really work through what was happening with the 737. And that group was comprised of, and is, about 15 different organizations, but also local, state, and federal representation as well. And as we were coming into this year, and then, March began to happen with COVID-19, we were at a moment where we were actually able to evolve that group into really addressing, in a larger context, what was happening with COVID-19. And so what that group has been focusing in on are three areas. One has certainly been the immediate response to how is it we make sure that the resources, we did a lot of work along with a lot of other community partners on PPE, and how is it that we would identify potentially those who could supply that, but or also produce it. That work continues. And then also concurrently working in the area of business. So as things begin to become available through the SBA and different stimulus aspects, we begin to work to make sure collectively that we were getting that information out. And then concurrently, what you have in front of you now is really beginning to look at our economic recovery. And so what we wanted to do, again, working with a number of partners, and actually on the last page of the document, so on page 7, you have all the different organizations. Now, all of these groups are actively involved in the task force, so this is actually like a subset of the COVID-19 community task force. This group of organizations, including the city, the partnership, REAP, Sedgwick County, Workforce Alliance, WSU, and Chamber, as we all work with economic development, came together and started to put together, if you would, a document that would achieve several things. One is that we wanted to be able to provide to you as our local leadership what are some of the key things that we know about the impact that we're seeing economically. Secondly, what are some of the things that we're going to be positioning as our strengths as we go forward? And then thirdly, is how is it that we see the opportunities to pursue certain projects that we have identified either through the regional growth plan or other strategies that may be in the community. And a big part of that is understanding as future stimulus packages may become available, we wanted to make sure that we had a consensus to say among these groups, this is what we're going to target going forward, and working collaboratively to be able to do that. So I'm going to walk through just at a high level the document, and then certainly Andrew and I can certainly answer any questions you may have. On the first few pages, again, this is economic data that we're receiving through a couple sources, one being certainly WSU working with Jeremy Hill, and that's where we're seeing some of these projections where you see, we could see up to 110,000 individuals either through furloughs or job loss, as far as layoffs and things of that nature. We have not hit that, but they're just saying that could be a projection to be mindful of as we work through the weeks and months ahead. The below that, you see a 40,000 number. Those are actually confirmed layoffs or furloughs that we've seen, and that, since this document was published April 23rd, that number has actually increased, and we're approaching 50,000. So again, we want to make sure we're keeping that current information in front of you as you're working in the conversations that you're having. You'll note this is a working document, so what we're going to do at the bottom of each page is always have a date on it, and we're going to hopefully make sure that you always have the current document in front of you as this is revised. On subsequent pages, as you look at it, like on page 2, one of the things we wanted to do is to give you concurrent information about what we're seeing with some of our core industries. There you'll see aerospace at the very top of that page, where we've had actually the impact of about 70% of our aviation workers either have been laid off or furloughed within the aerospace. Of course, in this area, we're having several dynamics, one being the 737 MAX, that initiated in January, and then that's been compounded, if you will, what's happened with COVID-19. And so as I've heard it described, it's like two black swan events where they're unique moments that you typically do not have. And so again, how is it that we want to capture those messages for you? Looking at oil and gas, certainly there have been a number of challenges in that industry, dealing with a decrease in the demand that's needed, but also just in the price per barrel of oil, really compounding challenges within oil and gas. Agriculture, again, a number of things, the volatility in markets, commodity sectors in the global markets. So that, again, hitting a major area that is a part of our economy. And then travel, tourism, and service industry. I know Susie Santo with Visit Wichita has done an excellent job of really capturing what type of impacts are we seeing there. What this information is really hitting is that we have seen also through Royal Caribbean or Celebrity Cruise Line, which is a major call center here, and then also Marriott or Starwood, you also have a large call center. So what we want to do is make sure we're defining for you all aspects of these different industries. So in addition to the individuals that work at hotels and conventions and things of that nature, we also have a huge influence with call centers that drive tourism as well. So again, major challenges within that sector as well. So what we're going to be doing over the weeks and months ahead is keeping that information up to date for you so that you have that available. The other part of this conversation is that as we're working with the state, we were with Secretary Tolan yesterday, is that as the state is working on our recovery as a state, they have information too about South Central Kansas that will hopefully complement the information they have as far as the breadth of it. The other is in recovery. So as the state's working, we're working hand in hand there. Also our federal delegation, we've actually had conversations with Senator Moran, Senator Roberts, working with our congressional leadership as well to make sure they have this information as they're working on the federal level. As you get into page 3, again, we think it's important that we always point back to those things that are our strengths. And a lot of that gets into the workforce and also the availability of building pipelines of talent. So that page actually gets into what are those assets as we continue to move forward. As you get to page 4, at the top, we draw back to the fact of what you're going to hear more about with the regional growth plan today is that we have within the last 16, 18 months developed strategies for our region through the regional growth plan, also the talent marketing blueprint that will be guiding principles as we go forward. And a lot of that has helped us in really looking at the type of projects that we've identified. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. These are projects that we can, with our partners, really work with where we think that we could see potentially movement as we go forward. And so at this time, I was going to have Andrew just kind of walk through those at a high level so that you can be apprised of why they're on the list, but again, how we're going to work as we go forward. So Andrew?
Sure, happy to, Jeff. And this focused investment, starting in the middle of page 4 through page 5, is really just highlighting some of the opportunities that are before us, and not just in Wichita and Sedgwick County, but in our region. The regional growth plan, our talent marketing blueprint, and other documents that our partner organizations have been working on highlight many of these, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. There's clearly other priority projects that could advance economic development. But in this vein of again, trying to communicate and trying to convey, where are the kind of the, I don't want to say low-hanging fruits, because some of these projects are very comprehensive, but what are those projects that are near term that we could really advance our economic development success out of this crisis? And these are, again, but a few of them. Some of them around by industry and kind of by sector, as the regional growth plan references. Aerospace is one of our sectors, and maintenance, repair, and overhaul, MRO, is that niche sector. If you remember diving deeper into our sectors, we talked about the niche opportunities, and MRO is one of those. MRO is the service side of aerospace. It's the fastest growing segment of the aerospace industry. We've had a strong presence in MRO in our communities past, with maintaining Air Force One for a number of years. We have it still with Bombardier. The majority of their flight testing and their operation in our community is dedicated to MRO. So we have that now. How do we expand that, and how do we enhance that even more? Some ideas around infrastructure investments, having a place to put some of these MRO operations, whether it be on an airport, on a runway, or off runway. But we see some near-term opportunities with even some infrastructure investments in not just Eisenhower, but even the east side of Jabara. Moving further down, aerospace defense, that's the other kind of niche sector or opportunity that we've talked about with diversifying aerospace and certainly going after more defense contracts. Also something that we're not starting from scratch from. We're very proud of our Air Force Base here. We're very proud of the defense projects that our major companies are already on programs. But how do we expand that even more? One way we think we could is with getting more of our supply chain, more of our 450 companies eligible for defense contracts. And as you all know, that's a very complicated process. It's being made even more complicated later this year by a requirement by the Defense Department called Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification. That's a new requirement that DoD is putting down. If you're going to do business with DoD, you have to have this level of cybersecurity certification. Many of our companies in our region do, but many don't. How do we help more of, particularly our smaller businesses in the supply chain, get that certification? Turning the page and getting into technology and innovation, a number of things that we think are primed for technology and certainly cross over to other industries like smart manufacturing, digital transformation and convergent science. We're seeing continued interest there, certainly by what's being led by Dr. Gold and the team out at WSU. We really see opportunities there, certainly with NIAR. Cybersecurity range is something that we've had a good investment in the past. The folks at Friends University are leading in that regard, and Wichita State are right there as well. So how do we expand on our cybersecurity capacity and the capacity of the 177th wing out at McConnell? So again, another tactical, tangible project that could advance cybersecurity, whether it's fiber infrastructure, transportation, logistics infrastructure. Clearly the North Junction, when you talk about the logistics sector, has to be a priority to us. It's the number one priority in the region, not just in this community. So we wanted to reinforce that one more time, although that's clearly getting some state and federal attention. And then a transload facility would be something akin to, and we've talked about in the past when we talk about logistics, but that would be akin to a smaller intermodal facility, usually dedicated to aggregates. We have some of that capacity in the community now, but how do we expand that? And that's but one idea. And then we kind of finish out the document on page 6 with some kind of shovel-ready sites. Again, by no stretch of the imagination an exhaustive list, because there's plenty of good high-quality development sites, but some sites that we think with a little bit of stimulus, a little bit of infrastructure support or some private support, potentially we could advance some economic development wins pretty quickly. So again, just a quick snapshot of what's included in this document. Jeff?
We'd be glad to answer any questions you have. And again, this is going to be a document that is one that is a working document, so it's going to be continually updated. The thing that we'd ask is from your leadership is that if there are things that you feel like we ought to include that we have not, or things that you feel like we need to make sure that we're noting from an economic impact, that would be helpful to know from you, because we want to make sure that this document is hitting what you need as we continue to move forward in the weeks and months ahead.
So any questions on that before we move on?
I do. Comments, questions, a couple different things, but I really want to express, I think this could be probably the most amazing opportunity Wichita has actually had in a while to do some things and show ourselves as a community that rises above maybe some other high-cost communities. There's a lot of manufacturing on the west and east coast, especially. I know that rail manufacturing is big in other countries and also on the east coast, which we could easily fit into here just as part of my experience in manufacturing. But some of those high-cost communities, some of those companies are going to have a very hard time restarting in those high-cost communities. How can we show ourselves as a lower-cost community, a community that it would benefit someone to actually relocate here? Would love to take your input on what parts of our regulatory environment might be hindering people from expanding, not opening here, or hindering people from moving here. What are you guys hearing? And what assets can the city use? I mean, WSU is an asset, obviously. NIAR, Center for Aviation Research, can go beyond just aviation research, but just manufacturing research. And I'm just trying to spew a lot of stuff out to you real quick.
I'm taking notes, yes, sir.
And then some of the other assets like our water infrastructure, we're building a brand new plant, we have plenty of water. I put air quotes around that, plenty. But, what can we do to show that we're poised, especially when it comes to some of those high-cost communities? How do we make ourselves attractive? Not just from, we've got a wonderful quality of life, we're really working on all that stuff, but, what allows some of those companies that are thinking about maybe not reopening to, if we locate to Wichita, maybe we can reopen. So that's just, I'm just spewed out a lot.
Yeah, well, I'm happy to respond just briefly, and I take notes, and we can certainly circle back on the specific items. But the short answer I'll say, and Jeff may have comment as well, but the short answer I'll say is we're monitoring the same things. Firstly, we continue to recruit nationally and internationally all the time. We've consistently done that. We're very excited about the kind of enhancements that our state partners have made at the Kansas Department of Commerce. They have reconstituted and rebuilt their recruiting and business development team on both of those coasts. We used to have kind of a leading team around the country, and we stepped away from that. Now we've rebuilt those teams. I can tell you firsthand the amount of deal flow and activity that my office sees has increased significantly since that's happened. But you're absolutely right. We need to be targeting those high-cost areas, and we think we have a compelling case to do so. We're also going to be looking, James, at how do we incorporate this new remote environment. I've been on a number of webinars and calls this last week of what is the new normal, and will we have companies looking for the same types of investments in facilities as they used to, or will that remote environment really be a new normal? And I think that actually, if there's other questions for sure, but that might help us transition to this document and the conversation on incentives, because there's probably other things, but the one thing I think I could give perspective to on what makes us competitive is our economic development incentive policies. But I want to stop there and always say that incentives are not the thing we lead with. And it was hopefully evident in that video for Tesla, and that while other places in the country, and there's lots of places in the country that have kind of raised their hand and said, we're interested in that, and they've done so on a monetary basis, we don't feel that that's our approach, and that's that our best value proposition is we've got the most incentives. The way I think we look at incentives, and it's really you all's calls our elected leadership, but when we look at incentives, our incentives there to break a tie. We think that what's going to win opportunities for our community and jobs for our region are going to be our workforce, are going to be our assets, our partners, the quality of life that we have. Those are the things that get us in the game. Now, business case decisions are complicated, and they're very competitive, and there's going to be times where we have to maybe sometimes break a tie or get down to closing a gap, and that's precisely what incentives are for. But I think that kind of transitions us to the next conversation we want to have about your economic incentive policy, if that's okay.
Andrew, I'd like to
Yep.
bring up one point. Councilman, you are hitting it exactly where we need to be thinking about the East and West Coast and along the Gulf Coast. And part of it that we're going to be doing to look at, one of the experiences we're drawing upon right now is I lived along the Gulf Coast when Katrina hit. And while that was certainly a concentrated disaster, if you will, with New Orleans, Mobile, going on over into Texas, one of the things that we saw post-event as far as Katrina is that communities that could communicate, this is where we are, but this is where we want to go. And they literally, Baton Rouge did this, where we had, we understood where we wanted to go economically as different stimulus packages or other opportunities. It doesn't have to be through stimulus funding. It could be through what you're hitting on as far as companies beginning to really think about. In New Orleans, what happened is that people who were either headquartered in that city or had major presence, they literally was shut down for a number of weeks. New Orleans was closed. And only if you had a company could you go in or a residence. So there was a disruption of commerce in that city. What happened is that in Baton Rouge, we saw a huge influx of business in the weeks, actually even the days following Katrina. And what happened is in those weeks and months that followed is that some of the companies remained to have a presence there in the event that disruption would happen again in New Orleans. So what we think is a possibility here is that as the East and West Coast is working and you have companies that are in those moments of being shut down, the Midwest, we do believe, offers a really good opportunity for either maybe another location or some presence to where if there is a disruption of this nature that we're seeing nationally, that it wouldn't necessarily have as large an impact in the Midwest. So what we're doing, and that was part of the catalyst for us to put a document like this in place. And all the partners came together to say, yes, this is important, because as we've had the conversations with our federal delegation, the state, and working local as well, is that as things become available, we can respond quickly to that moment of opportunity. The other is, as far as maybe a funding aspect, or how do we leverage that? The other part of it is that tomorrow morning we actually have the strategic advisory team, and that's a group. Bob is involved with that. I know Scott is as well. That's a group that we have around economic development with a partnership to have conversations like this. So we're going to, we have companies here with global presence and also other places in North America. I think we start with some of those conversations with like Koch Industries and Cargill and others to say, are there things that become applicable now to the Midwest that may not have prior to, because of what's happened with this pandemic? So I think there's a lot of opportunities for conversation right now to figure out what are those avenues, if you will, to identify maybe some things that we need to pursue in addition to what we already are. So that's part of making sure we understand where we want to go, and where this document helps us be speaking, if you will, from a common language, if you will, of the projects and things that we may be able to pursue in the weeks and months ahead.
Well, I really appreciate that very much. I just, if you notice, I didn't mention incentives because we really are limited on what we can do here. And I think that's why we changed our incentive policy. At one point, when I started on this council, we felt like we had to go toe-to-toe with cash. It was kind of an old model, a way of doing things. And I appreciate how you guys have really changed that up and helped us do that once we decided that was a policy change we wanted to make. But on top of it, even from your perspective, what is part of our regulatory environment that we can change or that we can relax that would help? Just putting my sales hat on, I want to find a problem we can fix for these companies, and I think this allows us to do that. I would love for Wichita to be the disruptor in the country as far as that goes. Just in last thoughts, in 2011 and 2012, we really did try to do things in an old model, an old way of doing things. So I appreciate everything you guys are doing this time around to change things up, because we just are going to have to think outside of the box and be that disruptor. That's why I enjoyed the video so much. It's going to turn their eyes, especially if you guys did some research on what they really care about. Especially if some of them geek out on the trucks, and everything that you guys were playing with. I was thinking of Tonka, my old Tonka trucks when I was that age. But
exactly what we were going for is the Tonka commercial.
So, thanks for thinking outside of the box, and that just asking that you guys would continue to help us do that. But especially hitting on our regulatory environment and what we can use that we have.
And Councilman, I think we will absolutely lean into that. I think we can have some feedback for you. I think our general approach, and we're happy to have a much deeper conversation with your staff and others about that on the regulatory side. I think we generally have good rules for good reasons, but I wouldn't completely separate the conversation of incentives with regulations, because I think there's some ways, and we're going to get into those recommendations, there's some ways we can tweak our incentive programs that'll make us more competitive, that aren't necessarily fiscal in nature. They're more money, and necessarily as much as how do we make our incentive tools a little sharper. So get into that.
I look forward to everything in all the tools in the tool shed.
Absolutely.
All right.
So, thank you. Just a couple questions about the current presentation. Is the group that comes together with you guys and with the manager that I think is coming together tomorrow, is that a group that helps with economic development policy?
So the strategic advisory team that Jeff mentioned that's meeting tomorrow, yes, that's
policy. Is there any elected officials on that group?
There's two, Councilman Blubaugh and Councilman Fry.
Okay. Also, just when we talk about regulatory environment or incentives, looking over it, not to jump ahead, but the next page, we have a slide that just shows after the recession, the majority of our comparable cities just really bounced back. The current data here shows that we actually are worse off now than we were during January 2008, and really even, 2008, and we're the only ones that are. Have we figured out roughly what these other communities are doing that we haven't been able to do? I mean, I'm sure it has to do with regulatory. I'm sure it has to do with some of this other, some of the things that have been mentioned by the council member, but also like, is there actually firm data or firm studies that have been done that shows a correlation between these, even the national trend, but all these other cities that are beating us right now in recovery that they're doing that we're not? Can we link that to a variable?
Yes, sir. So, perfect transition. Thank you for that question, because that tees this up really well. We've referred to this kind of internally as the spaghetti chart for obvious reasons as depiction, but it's the employment recovery chart. And you can see it's pegged against where is our recovery, where is our job growth compared to, not year over year, but our job growth compared to 2005. So looking, again, the point of this document, we've looked at this for several years, to harken back to what was it like before recession? Where are we pre-recession? Now, clearly, this is going to look dramatically different. I would argue that this might be the last time we show this and start to depict the data in a different way, because on the right side of this graph, all of those, every single city, are going to plummet because of COVID. So that notwithstanding, the comparison cities were derived from the previous BREG plan, these particular list of cities. But I will say, Mayor, that these specific cities, a portion of these were embedded into the 80 report that we're going to talk about. But this chart is in the presentation, and we've kind of kept it a part of this entire process with the 80 Advantage team and our analysis and leaning into economic development incentives with you all. This has really been the motivation. This is really what's been driving us, and looking at what we're doing. We are very competitive. We're doing some really good things, but we're clearly not making up enough ground. We want to do more. I think all of us collectively want to do more. How do we do more? How do we sharpen our efforts even more? So this is just really meant to kind of set the stage, but you're astute to kind of ask about the data points behind it, and we do have some.
Andrew, if you go back to the chart.
Yes, sir.
I think a lot of it, this chart was meant to be the kickoff for a discussion of diversification of our economy.
Okay.
And when you drill down to each of those markets, you'll find either a very diversified base or a base that responds quickly out of a recession. And so you have, I'm familiar with Des Moines, of course. Financial services is their core. They were able to rebound very quickly within 12 to 18 months after the start of the recession. And then many of these others, Dallas, Fort Worth, Denver area, you know how diversified those bases are. And I think that's why this was the kickoff for the BREG, or Blueprint for Regional Economic Growth Plan, because that plan was all about, we've got to do more than aviation manufacturing.
Right, and just follow up, and I'm glad this is where we should be starting, and it's a realistic view, and to be quite frank, it's a little shocking, right? Like, we could be doing better than Tulsa, for sure. Were these economies, and like I said, I'm trying to figure out variables here, like what are they doing that we're not, without falling on ideology or, different, I think policy biases that we might have. So my question to the manager and possibly to the conferee is, were these economies more diverse than ours to begin with, or did they do something to help grow that diversity? And if they were more diverse to begin with, is the diversity of the single a trend that we were just always less diverse than them, even though back in 2008 it looks like we were hanging relatively the same with these guys, right? And now we're just not. So if they were more diverse than we were to begin with, then why did we do well with them in 2008, but we're not doing well now? And if they weren't more diverse than us to begin with, then what did they do? And how can we kind of take a page from their playbook?
I'll give you my amateur version of what happened, and I'll let Andrew.
No opinion of yours
go
as
from
amateur,
there.
as a manager.
Yeah, I think what you're seeing is that aviation manufacturing prospered in that 2006, 7, 8 range, right? There wasn't a lot of inventory of used business jets, so they were selling a lot of jets. Commercial aviation was going well, and so as Spirit was starting to hit its stride in that regard. And then, so that put us on the same path as a lot of those other economies that were diversified or relied on other services. But I think what we found is specifically business or aviation, manufacturing, just didn't have the ability to rebound. And we actually lagged behind everyone else because it took folks, especially in the business jet market, right?
Oh,
There was a
absolutely.
significant market, significant inventory of used jets, and so people were buying used aircraft. I think we all know the story, right? And I think you could go through each of those and talk about how their mix of services was better able to rebound and not as reliant on, you know, the manufacturing of large ticket items that are sensitive to, you know, fluctuations in the economy.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And each of these markets, I mean, there's not a simple answer. Each of these markets has different strengths. Each of these are diversified in different ways. But I think it is fair to say that most of them started from a place of diversification. Many of them are also larger than us. We're only close to a couple of these markets in population. So those are key distinctions. But certainly the national average, Kansas City, some of our regional peers, Tulsa, Mayor is one certainly to keep apprised of, that we need to be monitoring exactly what they've done, and we have done that. Scott?
Yeah, just one quick note. I failed to put it up there because it's trying to limit slides, but actually year over year and between 2018 and 2019, when I mentioned we added 7,000 jobs, that was a faster growth rate than Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Omaha, for example. So we are seeing, now granted, it's all going to be relative to the COVID situation, but we did start to see a bigger rebound.
Yeah, you can see that just in the angle of ascent here, that compared to some of these other markets, this entire document would look different no matter where you move the y-axis. You move the y-axis, and this is a whole different story. And that's why I was just framing it as this has been our motivation. This has been, at least at the partnership level, this is something that drives our economic development team and really drove our conversations into why we wanted to engage 80 Advantage. So just to kind of set the stage a little bit further back,
Andrew,
certainly.
real quick, one
Sure.
question, Brandon.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I know we jumped ahead. I didn't want to cut the mayor off, but I want to jump back because I have a question for you.
Okay, that's fine.
When we look at the shovel-ready projects and sites, what is the thinking or criteria that put these three projects on here?
The thinking on that was which ones are near term in terms of shovel ready, which ones are projects that we believe both our federal delegation and our state delegation are well aware of, but this is really meant to be a way to remind them and to reinforce what they know about them. There's some certain degree of momentum towards these sites. It was also meant to be different size, different scale. You can see a site in the middle of Wichita, you can see a site in the region in El Dorado, so meant to be not just one. And again, really important to know that this is by no stretch an exhaustive list. This is really meant to just kind of color and flavor as we have conversations not only with the federal delegation, but federal agencies, with the Economic Development Administration, with HUD, with Kansas Department of Commerce, with all of those, that we can all be, we have something ready to go to be able to communicate if asked. Well, we might have some infrastructure dollars. What does that look like if we were to, well, there's lots of ideas, but these are but three.
Okay, so it was more looking at that, because I was curious with the administration putting more focus on opportunity zones, why those shovel-ready projects are not on here. I know,
Those absolutely could be on there as well, absolutely.
I think definitely they should be if this is not only coming to us, but presented to anyone that
Absolutely.
they know about those as well.
And I was frankly happy to see that the El Dorado mega site was on here, thinking obviously of Tesla, but, you know, honestly, anywhere in the region, if we were to land a large company or several companies, we'd take them anywhere in the, you know, at least immediate 5-6 county region, just because they're gonna employ people here. So I say that for us in the room here, it's obvious, but for some of our partner communities in Sedgwick County, Butler County, Harvey County, Reno County, that we probably would work with them too, I'd say, to land something big.
Well, I can't say this enough. The fact that you folks say that matters immensely. It's one thing for a smaller community in our region to be regional and to want good things to happen, because many of our communities, and we all do this when we're traveling across the country or traveling internationally, we talk about, well, where are we from? We're from Wichita. And our regional partners and friends in the 10-county area do that as well. But they're used to talking about the bigger place around them. To have our elected officials in the largest city in the region talk about those other communities and to laud them and to laud that when they get a win in their community, it's just as important to Wichita as if we were to win it, that matters immensely. So we thank you for that and encourage you to keep that up. It might seem like a small thing, but you as elected officials in the largest city in the region doing that really speaks volume, not only to the smaller communities and counties, but to the economic development folks that are trying to promote their places. So definitely important. But this is kind of background of kind of where we've been. Again, won't go through all of this because I think you've seen some of this in terms of having shared policy. The regional growth plan, which Jeff kind of talked about, was our comprehensive economic development strategy. It was really an update to the BREG plan, as Bob mentioned. That was really drilling down more specifically on our 7 target sectors, our 7 industries that we think can really help diversify our economy. One of the key initiatives was to really look at economic incentives. And I think it was worth bear repeating here that in the region, there's a number of communities in our 10-county region that have their own distinct economic development incentive policies, either at their city halls or their county courthouses. And because they've done a similar strategy and targeted industry analysis of what they're trying to advance their community or their economy with. But many of them don't. It might surprise you to know that many of the smaller communities and counties around us defer to yours. Yours is kind of the de facto policy for many of the communities in our region. And so that was so important that we wanted to drive this work forward because it's not merely just for Wichita's benefit, but really for the whole region. So we talked about some policy changes in 2018, 2019, and that brought us to the work in the fall of 2019. So we engaged Addy Advantage. Janet Addy's firm has been a longtime economic development consulting firm. Many of you met with their team as they came into town last summer, if you remember. So there were some of their clients, the phases I will show you in a minute, and then we had a task force, a group of private sector and public sector folks that leaned into this study with us from Addy Advantage. Kind of the 3 phases that they distilled their research and their work on local economic incentive policy. And that's important to note that we did not look at state tools. As you all recall, the lion's share of economic incentive tools in the Midwest, not just our state, but in the Midwest, are at the state level. So we were really drilling down our analysis on local tools. What do you all as elected officials have the authority by statute to do, and how can we refine those? So there was a multi-step process, a phased process. We looked at 4 states that were referenced in that spaghetti chart: Nebraska, Iowa, Oklahoma, and then the outlier, which was not in that chart, but one that we continue to evaluate because of their aerospace market, was South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. So those were the 4 states. We compared those metros. We also talked to site selection consultants. We talked to more than 10 site selection consultants on, give us your reaction to Wichita. Give us your perspective on our incentive tools. Where do we stack and where do we stand up? Then there was a facilitated planning exercise in the second phase that you all participated in. We engaged the region in that conversation very deeply, the economic developers, and then the city and county leaders through REAP. We engaged the real estate community. We had a very robust discussion of real estate brokers and developers that leaned into this process, and then some private sector businesses through our SAT team, and then produced the final report in December to you all. So this is just a super quick recap of the findings of that report that was about 90 pages and about 5 or 6 slides. So I wanted to just kind of highlight some of their findings. But what Addy Advantage, this National Economic Development Consulting firm, found through their analysis, looking at other states, looking at our policies, they culled through all of your policy documents. One of the things, and probably the strongest recommendation they've discovered, was our policy, our current toolbox, the requirements of those tools exceed state law. We have in many instances regulations and stipulations that go beyond what state law requires. That's the first thing they found. Didn't make a judgment call on that, but we had robust discussion on the task force of, in this competitive environment, should we be exceeding state law? Maybe there's some instances where we should, but maybe there's some instances where we shouldn't. We need to stick to state law to be able to be the most competitive that we can be. So that was one of their findings. Tax abatement benefit to cost ratio, that's one we're going to talk quite a little bit about, and so I'm going to skip that for now, but we'll come back to that. Another one that they found, and they found this across the country, this isn't merely just in Wichita, but citizens are generally uninformed or misinformed on incentives. They're talked about a lot in the media and on social media and in kind of community gatherings, but maybe not well understood, and that's understandable. So how do we as a community, how do we as the partnership arm you all as elected officials in our communities with the data points and the storytelling to be able to tell that story about the benefit of incentives where we can? tie incentives to our targeted industries. That's one thing that they noted, that while there was a reference in our current policies towards our targeted industries, there's no direct tie or coordination between the two of a further inducement and further enhancement of, we want to see this industry grow more, ergo our incentives are encouraging that more. So there wasn't that direct delineation in our policy. Flexibility was certainly key. They did note that Wichita was ahead of the curve by a large margin in what's called post-performance. So most incentives historically, and James mentioned this, that incentives used to be the approach of let's give the money at the front end and hope the company or the project meets its goals and its projections. And if not, then we have a clawback situation where we have to get that money back from them because we've extended some outlay of cash. Economic development incentives across the country have shifted, not completely, but have shifted away from that as a general rule. And so now they're more post-performance. And not necessarily shifted away from cash entirely. There still might be a cash component in many of our competing cities, but what they do is after the job has been created, after that performance has been met, then there's the economic benefit. And so that's where the distinction lies. And then again, the misalignment with the regional growth plan that I'm going to talk about. These are some of their recommendations, taking those findings into recommendations, and we're going to go through a few of these in greater detail, but I wanted to kind of just hit on a couple of them here. They had 7 key specific recommendations. Aligning the regional growth plan with your target industry or your niche sectors, that's very important. That's something that we can't be all things to all people. We can't incentivize every project under the sun. How do we have an approach where some industries that we know based on the regional growth plan are going to advance our economy more? How do we encourage them more? Maybe it's not a all or nothing. Maybe there's an approach to have some incentivization for a wide variety of companies and industries, but those that we know through data are going to advance our economy more. How do we further encourage them or further induce them? Adapt program structure would be really following the lines of kind of streamlining process, kind of looking at perhaps targeting geographies in addition to targeting industries. That's something that the city policy has done to a degree, and that certainly the opportunity zones do that at the federal level, but how do we adapt that program structure for a more modern economy? Benefit to cost ratio, I have a slide on, so we're going to talk about that. Post-performance and community reinvestment is something that you're starting to see around the country, and for kind of leading communities of how do we encourage employers that are not just bringing jobs, not just bringing high-paying jobs and good wages or investment that affects our tax rolls, but how do we encourage or support them investing in our communities, investing in our nonprofit organizations? How do those go together and how do those play together was a recommendation of the 80 team. Educating stakeholders was something they talked about and strongly encouraged us to, as a partnership, to kind of figure out how do we support. Also looking at small businesses. And I always like to say that there's really nothing in our current policies really don't get at, it's not a big business versus a small business. You have nothing in your policies that say, small business, you can't benefit from this. As a general rule, though, the way the math works, most of these are formulaic. Just the way the math works, the larger companies are going to be the ones that receive the larger offers just because of their sheer investment and the sheer impact that their projects make. But how do we take maybe resources or investments by larger companies and perhaps steer those or utilize those for smaller businesses or encourage investment in smaller businesses? That's something that isn't done perfectly across the United States from what 80 found, but that's something that they're willing to dig into a little bit more, and perhaps we do. And probably one of the newest trends before COVID was really looking at how do you utilize your incentive tools to attract talent. Generally speaking, incentives, this is an oversimplification, but generally they've been to kind of help the bottom line of that company, which ostensibly goes to the benefit of the employees. That makes that company more competitive and supports their workforce. But how do we also then encourage companies to attract talent or retain talent or grow their talent here even more than our current toolbox does? So those were the kind of the themes that they followed and the recommendations that they made. I'd like to jump into kind of some of them specifically if this helps. And the first kind of big one that we probably had the most robust discussion around was with your property tax abatement policy and really looking at the benefit to cost ratio. So as you all, I think, are well aware, historically you've had a 1.3 to 1 benefit to cost ratio. For every dollar of cost, your policy is looking for 30 cents on that dollar additional benefit. And the way we calculate that is through the Center for Economic Development Business Research fiscal model. It's a fiscal analysis and looks at fiscal flows of revenue. It incorporates and bakes into it kind of macro and indirect benefits. It calculates things like hotel room nights. But what actually applies to that formula that you all look at is actually the fiscal revenues. So that would equate to the bed tax revenue portion of that project flows into that number. What we have found, and the committee, the task force discussed extensively, was perhaps that ratio of 1.3 to 1 was established and developed in a different interest rate environment, a different time, a different competitive time from continuing to seek economic development projects. So that's something we had a lot of robust discussion about. We have found as the partnership, when we're talking with companies about expanding and trying to match up or project or help them guesstimate what would that benefit be were they to make the investment, because many times companies are wanting to have an idea of what that is before they all come to you in a public fashion. We found many instances where sometimes that can be a hurdle. That can be a hesitation for them to, wait a minute, I have to meet that criteria, and what if I don't meet that criteria? If I do fall below that line, what happens? We've approached it a lot of different ways from a policy standpoint. Probably the most common way that we've approached the 1.3 to 1 benefit is if the company doesn't meet that ratio, we reduce the economic benefit that they receive, which just through formulas, through mathematics, that gets the number back up. Sometimes that's a smidgen, a haircut, and it doesn't really affect a project. There have been instances where it has. And so your policy provides some caveats, some outs to that, some exceptions to that. But as we discussed it, we thought, are we making it harder on ourselves than it needs to be? Really, does the public expect a 30% return on every dollar? Or is it really we want this to be a positive investment for the community and as a one-to-one return, the better way to look at that?
So Andrew, I have a question on that. When you say that that's been sometimes a challenge or a hurdle with projects that we've seen in the past, are you talking about projects that would be new to the area? Not just expansion, I understand, we see that sometimes, but also just totally new companies coming here, have kept them from coming here because of this ratio?
I don't know that I have an example of that was the sole factor, but I can tell you we have companies, new companies coming inbound to Wichita that it's been a part of the conversation. But you're right, the vast majority of the projects we work on are expansions. And that's true to any business. Most of your growth in revenue, if you're a business, comes from your existing customer base. Same premise in economic development. Most of our job creation, most of our projects are going to come from companies that are already here. But yes, those are the ones that worry me the most and keep me up at nights, that if we have it's such a competitive landscape out there that if we have anything that gives us even a slight disadvantage, that would be a concern. So the 80's recommendation is really to look at how do we get to a one-to-one benefit to cost ratio, and then it provides you all, as the elected officials, maybe the latitude to be able to analyze that project in that particular moment. Some other changes under tax abatement that are threaded across the 80 report, but then as the task force started to look into it a little bit more, adjusting the wage standard. So our wage standard today is 100% of the metro average, or 100% of the metro average by your industry, or 100% of the average less aerospace. So we have an aerospace sector that clearly, with OEM and large employers, skew the wages up. So we have been very accommodating in that regard, and the policy has been accommodating to kind of downgrade or adjust that wage standard accordingly. One of the things that our task force decided was, rather than having two different standards, and it can get fairly complicated, and even I as the economic developer have to stop and think and how to articulate it, how do we simplify it? And one of the ways to simplify it would be to match up to the state. And so the state of Kansas uses a wage standard of 100% of median wage. They look at median wage because that gives you a true middle point of what that company or that project is looking at, so median wages. When we've looked at, is there an adjustment for 120% for any company, or is that a lower standard, 100% for a company that would maybe hire a disadvantaged worker, somebody that's been through long-term unemployment, those kind of things. So that's kind of an adjustment to your wage standard, a proposal to adjust your wage standard of your tax abatement program. And then also a scoring system, which I have here. This is a fairly deep chart, and I'll stop after this for questions, but this looks at the 80 recommendation on how do you adapt your program structure to see benefits and see actions that you want to see based on your regional growth plan, based on your studies. And so how do we encourage investment as opposed to maybe precluding or stopping investment? And so what this does is really simplifies the categories. We still calculate this. These percentages are meant to calculate the benefit. How do we get to the percent of tax abatement over a 10-year period? That's the maximum term of state law under tax abatement. So these percentages really mean what is that percentage of benefit that the company would receive. Still have a calculation based on jobs and on capital investment much like the current policy. But then really kind of the new feature, we simplified some things a little bit, but really the new feature is that bottom section where it's kind of a bonus point structure. How do you add on a benefit to a company when you see them performing some of the actions that we hope we'll see and that were in the 80 report and in the regional growth plan. So these are meant to be additive. So as an example, a company that's creating 5 jobs and investing $6 million in a facility based on jobs and capital investment would be eligible for an 80% tax abatement. But then if they're in the regional growth plan, one of those key 7 sectors, maybe they get an additional 10%. Or if they're looking at making a commitment to talent attraction, that adds another 25% on their tax abatement score. And figuring out exactly what those components are and what those requirements and how do we hold them accountable to the taxpayers' monies, those details will be worked out. But that's the theme that was embedded here in a scoring system. This has become a far more common approach of inducing the behaviors you want to see as opposed to saying, well, you're not eligible based on this criteria.
If you go to page 8 on Scott's PowerPoint, it's actually slide 16, he has outlined here an example to run through that matrix. No, let's keep your matrix
okay.
up.
Yeah, go back to your slide.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so under Scott's example, you have a company, and again, Andrew said that the nice part about this approach is that it also can target smaller business investment, right? So here you have 10 new jobs, so that gets you on this chart a 30% abatement. And then they're putting $4 million into their facility, and that will get them a 40%. And then if it's a target industry that'll help us on the diversification strategy for the regional growth plan, that will get us 10%, so now they're at 80%. And if they're successful in leveraging Kansas incentives, then they can get up to 90% abatement. So that's just one great example of a way to walk through this, to give you an idea of how this would be applied.
And the point on that's a great reminder from you, Bob. The point on that is leverage. We're wanting to encourage these companies to not solely lean on the incentive tool that the city of Wichita has, but to encourage them to work with the state of Kansas, encourage them to work with Evergy, our utility partner, if they were to be eligible. It's, again, about leveraging and maximizing your dollars as opposed to going it alone. Scott?
Just a couple of additional things. Our current matrix is very quantitative. Number of jobs, wage, capital investment. And that's strictly what it looks at. What this also tries to do is encourage, I'll call it the qualitative aspects of a project. So for example, if they're considering multiple sites, but one of those sites is in an opportunity zone, that may bump 25% more on their abatement. That may drive them to consider an area that they maybe in the past have said, well, let's just go out to a quote unquote greenfield site. Or, hey, we want to bump up from 70 to 100. Let's agree that we're going to commit to hiring 20% of these new jobs will be disadvantaged, or maybe individuals who have a criminal record of how do we ban the box type of opportunity. So this is an opportunity for council members or council to consider not just a quantitative aspect of a project, but a qualitative. Currently, it becomes this hard exception for council to consider things other than, I'll call it the black and white aspects of a project. We want to encourage their success, but also encourage not just the high wage earners, but how do we lift up the other side as well as invest in challenge areas and invest in those individuals to move up in the wage scale.
Yeah, and I think another important one too is the small business aspect, which we've not really had as a component in our incentive policies. This allows for entrepreneurships and angel or new startups to have a seat at the table and a way to get some incentive or participate where they haven't in the past. So.
Well, one of the things that I've really been concerned about in our incentive policy are, Scott, some of the things that you had mentioned is the qualitative or the intangible benefits to the community that you cannot really quantify at all. And the one about banning the box, people that maybe are unemployable, we made an exception because it was a really great exception for a company, as far as our tax abatement goes, to help them expand, because that's all they employ are people that are unemployable, and it was really great to be able to make that exception. But if it's built in, maybe that even encourages more of that kind of activity, and you just can't quantify. As a matter of fact, it probably blow the numbers through the roof if you knew that the crime that was being diverted and some of the things, the social things that we are not having to pull resources into anymore. So
We would agree. We would largely encourage that because while it is more difficult and sometimes challenging to quantify perfectly, and there's nothing against our current policy and our current approach, it's a fiscal model. It's a very good model. You can have confidence that you know that revenue is coming in. But I would argue, as your economic developer in the region, it looks at a fiscal approach and doesn't perfectly capture those intangible benefits. And so that's what largely was driving some of these recommendations of how do we broaden that scope of some of those other elements.
But it's not a wide open
Sure.
door, right? In
Right.
terms of, because you're right, I mean, we could probably come up with, oh yeah, this will decrease our need for public safety. That's
Well-
hard to quantify or give bonus points on, but I do think.
That's not where I was
what we've
going, Bob.
listed-
Just saying. That's not where I was going.
Yeah, I know. But I just want to make sure that everybody that's listening too understands, this is, I mean, it is, even if, there'll still be some quantifiable
Right.
tie
Yeah,
back
has
to
to be,
this,
yeah,
right,
absolutely,
yes,
yeah.
So we got the boxes to check. But, Jeremy Hill, who's, the owner of our model, has encouraged us to move in this direction for a number of years.
Yeah.
Because he said, he does a great job of analyzing what you put into the model, but it doesn't take in some other factors, and especially the ones that I would say are in alignment with policy considerations of the council.
And I add to that because I often say that Jeremy's model is the best there is. I mean, it really is.
Yeah.
He's brought in by other communities across our state to help them create their model. So it is the best there is. It's just, Jeremy would say if he was here, it's not perfect either, so.
Well, just even on the subject of those that are unemployable, not very employable, we know, and the change in this policy and how it can help our region, we know that most of the people released from prison in the state of Kansas are released to Wichita. So that gives us a disadvantage as far as the potential for higher crime because people are looking for jobs, but they can't get jobs, So if that was part of our incentive policy, if you're going to employ those people that maybe are unemployable and tap into some resources that we have to help companies employ those sorts of people, we can bend the curve in other areas too. Not saying that we're doing it in a way to decrease public safety dollars, but, to increase public safety.
Yeah, I understand. Can we go back 2 slides?
Oh, sure.
What we'd like to do is, instead of hitting you all at the end on this, I'd like to have pause points. And so you've got 3 policy changes here that are recommended by that group, by SAT and by the partnership.
Yep.
And I'd like to know what your general thoughts are as we put the final policy together. Are you comfortable with these 3 recommended changes?
Got to remember that the one-to-one is still a net positive return. So anything above that is still going to benefit the community, and that's why it's still acceptable.
And keep in mind, we've limited our analysis. There are some communities, not many, but there are some communities that look at the totality of the project even after the incentivized period.
Yeah.
So this analysis looks at years 1 through 10 while you're giving the incentive. It does not constitute year 11 and beyond when the incentive is rolled off.
Right.
And all of that tax revenue, all of that benefit is coming in. So it merely looks at during the incentivized period, you're still over 1-to-1.
Well, and I would challenge, I've seen over the 8 years I've been around, almost every single company that we've incentivized, their numbers have been better or quite a bit better than normal. Sorry, Becky.
No problem. I was just going to say, Andrew and I have talked robustly about this. There have been 2 examples this year alone where, in some way, it was District 2, but NetApp moved from District 2 to District 1. You still owe me, Councilman Johnson. And then Open Road Brands that expanded that didn't meet the 1 to 1.3. And so we decided as a council that we would make exceptions. But if we would have been hard, fast, or not looked at the impact on the community and what it was going to do, it would have been a real miss for us because both of those are great expansions in the city and niches other than aviation and what we're always looking at. So something we've talked about and I would be supportive of revisiting.
And those were ones that were already here and knew of our policy. Yeah. And those that are thinking about coming here or expanding to might not even look at us because they can't hit that number and they know they can't.
Right.
So I have a question on the wage standard. Would the change push the median wage up or down?
It's hard to say, Councilman. As a general rule, as a general simplification, your median wage, your middle point of your wages, is generally going to be lower than your average wage on as a general rule, but there are many instances where that's inverted, particularly in smaller companies. No, as a general rule, the median wage standard is going to soften it, but not by much. I want to remember $2,000 or $3,000 is on average.
This would also mirror the peak program that the state has. So really, when we have that extra 10%, I think, if they're using local incentives, then it helps tie it all together. If they're going to use that program, and then they can use this because we're mirroring the same numbers.
And this will make it easier for some small businesses.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, and that's the key benefit we see is the simplification for them. They're still going to have to calculate their average wage for some of the other Kansas state programs, but to have kind of our main program and the state's main program, peak, line up and have them find that calculation and be confident in it will be a big benefit. Right now, we have them kind of pulling several different numbers and standards, and even great companies, it slows down the process, and they have HR professionals, but they don't calculate these kind of things on a daily basis, so this will help.
Just adds to the confusion.
Other questions?
Yeah, I think it's the next slide. Who defines what a redevelopment area is?
So there is language in your current policy today in terms of what you have as redevelopment areas. I would constitute, and I think it's fair to say that opportunity zones are, but I'll let Scott answer. There is delineation on which are redevelopment areas and which aren't.
Sure. Mayor, Councilmember Johnson, opportunity zones is one of those that we've identified. Currently define redevelopment areas that we may determine in the future that may become redevelopment areas. I think of the Delano area that just went through the conservation declaration process. That might be one that we want to consider. It is those areas that council may decide that need additional help or have unique circumstances to consider. There's been some discussion about, do we bring back the NRA program, which had that designation, or former enterprise zones, if you remember back 20 years ago, that had certain declarations that the federal government put on certain areas. We would say those would be eligible as well.
Yeah, I don't think we finalized that definition. I think we just said these are some areas that could be considered as part of it, but it needs further definition.
And we'll need, right, exactly, we'll need to bring that forward so you can designate those.
And I would add to that, this will kind of parallel some of the state's work. So I'm fortunate to be part of the Framework for Growth process, which is the state's version of the Regional Growth Plan. And they're looking at several of these same elements. And one of the things, just a proposal at this point, they're looking at one of their geographic-based incentive tools. It's called the Rural Opportunity Zone. It's just where you would think it would be in the rural parts of our state, but they're actually looking at adding a feature, an urban opportunity zone to go kind of parallel with that. And so they are leaning more into geographic-based considerations for their incentives. So I think that would match up well for your all's consideration. Mayor?
How does this new formula you present compare to Kansas City, Kansas, or Johnson County, some of the regions that have seen job growth, particularly when you talk about lining up to state standards? Are they lined up to state standards? Are they doing anything that you're proposing today?
It runs the gamut, I would say. I know that city staff has done some analysis on kind of what other cities do on an individual tool basis. As you know, each municipality and each locality that has their tools are all different. They have local control, so they've approached it differently. Just having spent some time up there in Kansas City, I would say that as a general rule, I would say that, again, oversimplification, but many communities in the Kansas City area's processes are a little simpler. Their benefit kind of calculations are a little more streamlined, a little more simpler. I would say probably the more common approach across the state is the 10-year analysis. When most communities extend a tax abatement, it's for the full 10 years. It was unique to me to come here and have the 5, how we couch it as a 5+5, that kind of that midpoint review, I think is unique across our state. It makes some sense from an analysis standpoint, but that's another just kind of hurdle that a company has to overcome. So that's something to think about, is that competitive element. I would say most communities in Kansas provide a tax abatement. It's for the full 10 years, and if something happens in the middle of that project, then they address it then. But in terms of a ratio or percentage, it really runs the gamut. There's some communities that are a little more restrictive in the amount of benefit they'll give. There's some that are more aggressive than probably our past matrix has been, for sure. There's some communities that just do 100% tax abatement for 10 years every single time. That's common as well.
So, Andrew, when Addie looked at this, though, they didn't look at this in a vacuum. They looked at what other communities were doing, what's worked, what hasn't worked.
They did, yes.
And brought
Yes.
their expertise to this process.
Exactly. And beyond just Kansas, those other 4 states and those metros in those states, for sure.
Does this then match some of what those other communities are doing?
It does, and particularly in the themes, particularly in the recommendations and the tone and the approach. How you get into the details of it is for your staff, I mean, to really get down into the nitty-gritty of how did we actually put this into a policy, but particularly things around aligning to your target industries. That's a leading trend. Using the incentives to attract talent, that's a leading trend. How do we take the concepts or the themes of what's happening around the country? Each state is different, their tax structure is different, their public hearing processes are different, those kind of criteria can change, but the themes, I think, is really what Addie was trying to help us give you all perspective on. And you should have said at the beginning, also provided this presentation to the county commissioners, so you have a joint policy with them, and so they've seen these recommendations as well.
So one thing I would like to do, since you had mentioned more council discussion is, and not today, but have a council discussion on what community reinvestment looks like. It's great to give money to nonprofits, and that should happen, but at the same time, if we have identifiable needs in the community, maybe we can list those, and that could be the type of investment. So for instance, affordable housing is a real need. Maybe that's one of those investments that, maybe they reach out to a Habitat or a Mennonite or a Power CDC or something like that it's focused so we can actually see that type of benefit around a need.
That's extremely common. Another common approach is around transit. How do we encourage companies to invest in transit or to drive resources to transit projects? I mean, those, absolutely.
Second shift.
So really simplifying the benefit to cost ratio, simplifying the wage standard, and then encouraging kind of those qualitative things that we're trying to accomplish with our economic development strategies is really kind of the theme of these 3. These are really, I would say, argue the largest 3 recommendations. There are some smaller things that I'm happy to get to when you have your complete your discussion about these, but these are really the 3 largest recommendations.
This was done over like 4 different meetings that we had.
Yeah.
With a lot of private developers, private industry, county. And this was the most time we've spent.
Yeah. And Brian, I appreciate your time in that. We got very deep into the weeds on this, into the statute, so we appreciated your volunteering.
And Jeff he's
Jeff
here listening.
Oh, is he? Okay.
He can't interact.
Okay.
So.
Andrew, can I ask kind of a probably silly question? It's following up a little bit on James's great comments earlier, but if we did simplify the ratio to 1-to-1 instead of 1-to-1.3, in case there are industries out there or even local businesses that were deterred because of the higher ratio, I mean, would there be a plan that we can communicate not only within our city, our region, but our nation? We're open for business and being adaptive right now. I keep saying the industries, the organizations, the whatever, the people that are going to make it after this are the ones that are the most adaptive. And so to me, this seems like a good strategy to do because we're changing our model because the world is changing, right? But if we do it and then nobody really knows it, it might be for naught. So is there...
That was definitely one of the reasons why we want to push this forward. And have this retreat so we could strike while the iron's hot, so to speak.
Okay.
Right?
If I can,
Becky, I think absolutely we would support your economic development team here inside City Hall with communicating that. Obviously, that's what the partnership does in terms of messaging and marketing and promotion. So we will absolutely be doing that hand in hand with you. For
Yeah,
sure.
and not to disappoint our communications team, but people aren't really just sitting around on Saturday night looking at our website, right? So I mean, I think it's going to have to be some robust and unique strategies.
Proactive, for sure.
Yeah, very proactive.
Yeah, that was one of the findings that he talked about early. Most people don't understand our incentive policy.
Yeah.
They get confused all the time,
Yeah.
and this would be a way to help communicate that. We know that that's got to be a key factor coming out of this. How do we explain this to the public, what we're doing, how it's changed, how it's still going to benefit the community, and how it's going to hopefully pay off for us. But communication is definitely a key piece of it.
In our, you wouldn't know this, Andrew, but we held a class called Civic Engagement Academy, and we learned that it's to teach people how to be engaged with their municipal government. We learned early on that if we didn't talk about economic development during that program, and if we didn't talk about it early, every class, there was a question about, well, why do they do this? Why? And then it has been so popular. Tim Goodpasture comes in and does this, and then people understand, they can relate to that, then the whole class, like, oh, we do that because what Tim said, you know? And I think it's really, I think that has really, you know, it's a small class, so we're only, you know, hitting 25 people at a time, but this is what Brian's speaking to, is that when people understand it, they're much, they then support the projects, and they understand why we do things. It's not just random.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time talking about that communication piece.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have to, because it's not easily understood. It's talked about a lot, I would say, but it's not easily understood, and it's complex. I mean, take an example, your council packets are 15 or 20 pages just on one tax abatement consideration. Well, that amount of documentation is not easily fit into the media. There's just no method that they can do that, or that the public would probably absorb all of that data. So how do we synthesize and boil it down and make those messages a little clearer? I think absolutely.
If I can add two additional things, there's important 2 words changed in this document. We went from a policy, economic development policy, to economic development guidelines. And the goal is to respond to Addie's flexibility, openness to considerations. One of the things that happened, I think way before I got here and since that time, is the 1.3 to 1 became this hard, fast rule. And then to consider something different from that became the word exception, which, as we talked with our local businesses, like, why am I an exception? Why? That almost has a negative connotation. And so the message is, guidelines provides you as a council body some greater flexibility to consider additional considerations instead of saying, we're going to consider your project as an exception. Something was wrong or broken with it. This way, we want to look at the hard numbers, but as well as take these additional considerations and say, we want to look at this project looking at both sides of the benefits.
Find a way to say yes.
Yep.
Well, Scott, don't you think that especially as we go forward in the recovery period and we move towards the diversification recommendations or goals, that we may, that softness, that ability to negotiate through guidelines may be a lot more helpful, and recognizing the council may want to do some things differently in the next 18 months than what you will do after that period, right?
And one thing I would add, that this work completed in 2019, so of course pre-COVID, but one of the things that I'm hearing regularly, and I know Scott and I have talked about it, is how do we start to incorporate this remote environment and this remote mindset? And there's going to be some limitations, the way just mechanically some of our instruments work. You all know, as economic incentives are really essentially a stopping or a withholding of a flow of government revenue. So there has to be that flow to be able to give the incentive, other than the kind of the abstract idea. We have to have that flow of revenue. So things like incentivizing a company to have somebody work from their home mechanically doesn't work perfectly. There's some limitations by state statute and limitations in those flows of how do we capture that residential. That's a question that hasn't been answered. But the theme or the concept that our economy is going to be shifting to more of a decentralized or remote environment would be another theme that if we were to have 80 do this report today, I'm confident that's one thing that they would want you all as electeds and us as an economic development group to chew on and talk about, and how do we reflect that potentially new reality in our economy, for sure.
I think it's important in our strategy and communication that, you know, time and time again, we talked about the community not understanding incentives and what an IRB is. I mean, when we help one of our aircraft companies with $50 million in IRBs, people think we're writing a check for $50 million, right? So that's important in our communication strategy, but also we focus so much on the businesses and not necessarily on the jobs and the families and the lives that it's impacting in a positive way. And so in our communication strategy, my hope is that we could also put more human interest behind that communication strategy. Because we're not, time and time again, you'll hear people say, oh, they're giving money to big businesses. You know, they're feeding big businesses. They're, you know, and people don't see the benefit. They just don't connect the benefit. And so adding that human interest, the impact on families, the ability for families to go to the store, buy food, you know, participate in quality of life initiatives and those sorts of things be something I think would be extremely beneficial.
You're right, because Scott talked about a couple of key words that we changed in here. One of the other words that we changed was from public benefit to community benefit, to really stressing how the community is going to benefit from these deals. It's a little bit more immediate, intimate than just public. So that's another word that we caught that we introduced into the vernacular.
And just kind of on what the two council members are saying, I think that we can still have we'll still have the 1.3 analysis if we wanted to. This, I think, kind of lowers the bar a little bit, but allows a bigger discussion on those intangibles, on the qualitative data. I mean, that seems like the read on this is that instead of basing it just off of more of a formalistic perspective on, you know, I think the staff has said pretty much the hard rule that was being utilized to almost weed people out. This, other numbers, down. Did my mic, okay, did you guys cut me off? Go down, I think that from the presentation, the qualitative, the other benefits, the story, how this fits into how this might actually attract that down the road, it brings a more complete picture before we make decisions. And I think if someone came to the council and they just met the bare minimum of this standard and didn't have kind of the rest of that story to show why they would be deserving these benefits, I doubt we'd pass it. Like, I'm sure that it allows us more flexibility, it seems, by changing just the standard of what comes in front of us.
Absolutely, Mayor. I would agree wholeheartedly. I mean, there are going to be some applications, and sometimes, you know, working out with your staff team, they never even really get to the public moment because they're clearly not a project that your policy supports and aren't a good use of fiscal use of economic development resources and taxpayer resources. But I think what this will do just that. It will soften that criteria a little bit and provide wider latitude for those projects that we've had some projects where they've had really high-paying jobs and really good impact, but because the capital investment is so high, just the way the formula works, the math works, it gives the appearance, as Scott has said, is there something wrong with the project? It's a 1.1 to return. Well, it's thousands of jobs and tens of millions of investment, but just the way the math works, it kind of comes off as, well, wait a minute, that's not quite good enough. So I think this will definitely help soften that.
And just to add to that, I mean, we have to vote on all these coming forward.
Absolutely.
So if we have people, personally, if our standards are higher anyways, then vote no.
Yeah,
right?
you have
It's
the
not-
latitude, sure.
Okay, generally comfortable with going forward on that. We've got a number of other recommendations here. The second bullet point, we don't even, on your next slide, we don't even need to talk about, because we've already said we're gonna define those for the council. We'll work on that.
Yeah, and these are mainly, I won't touch on these a lot, these are pretty specific. We're going from very high, broad recommendations to fairly tactical and small process kind of things in terms of, as we really dug in very deep into the tax abatement consideration, some of these issues came up, some are provided by your staff, some by some of the companies that have utilized the programs in the past, so I won't go through them in great detail, but again, just simplifying the process. Really, this slide is meant to, and these recommendations are really meant to simplify and provide clarity into the process. So on sales tax exemption IRBs, do you need to go through the same cost-benefit analysis? We would argue no. Do you, a cleanup period on, you have serial or major investments like at Textron and Spirit, maybe clean up some of that review process and some of the requirements there. State law does not require you to have two public hearings on IRB issuance. We would recommend, again, whatever it can do to simplify the process. We talked about
that because it actually creates a lot of confusion with the public.
It does.
It's like, we already did that. Why are you coming back? Is this a new request? No, it's the same one.
Yeah.
So
Right.
we don't have to do it. Why do it?
Right, yeah. Again, and the last two are kind of things that we're already doing. You do have an acknowledgement of within the region, inter-regional competition, that we don't want to see a company pick up from one place in our region and just relocate to Wichita and get an incentive based off that, but maybe further defining that a little more clarity of what happens if that company has net new jobs, so it's over and above, or what happens when they have no other place to go. I mean, those kind of things. Again, the staff does a good job of working with them on a case-by-case basis. Those are few and far between, I would say, but I would also say that the more Wichita Wichita takes a leadership position here of really reinforcing, here's what we want to see. We don't want to see companies coming into our city from the region. That speaks volumes to the smaller communities around us. And then some language about clawbacks for sure could certainly be cleaned up. Switching gears, kind of a wholesale shift here, and this is really kind of, I think, leads to, I think, the rest of Scott's presentation in terms of what we consider, what we call development incentives. So moving off of tax abatement, which is our primary tool for our major industries or our basic industries that bring dollars into our economy, development incentives are those that are broader in scope, your tax increment financing, your TIF, your CIDs, even we don't do TDDs as commonly anymore, but those all would be considered development incentives. We didn't spend a ton of time on those just because I think our IRB discussion was so robust, Brian.
Before you get too far into development, as it relates to the tax abatement, do we have to have that as a policy change from the bench? And if so, what's our timeline looking at as to when we could do this?
Yeah, I'll start off and then Scott, you can refine it.
And if I've jumped the gun on that, I apologize.
No, we
but
wanna
since
do
we're on
this-
this, I figured,
Yeah, sure.
let's get it.
We want to do it as part of the wholesale document, right?
Okay.
Your new guidelines. And what you're doing is you're setting the stage. We're going to take all of this, put it into a new document, then we're going to get it to the county because the desire is to have the commission and the council approve it together.
As an en banc type of,
Probably would do an en banc.
okay. So we're still talking a month or two, at least.
The goal is to get feedback today. That's the purpose of the retreat. Proposal we'll talk about with the guidelines just after Andrew's. Most of these we're already embedding into the document. And our recommendation is take the further comments such as the affordable housing, community investment, adaptive, those, streamline the document to incorporate those changes, and then we bring that document together for council and commission consideration. I know, Andrew, you've been to the commission before. I spoke with county staff yesterday who said they've agreed to the items that Addie and the SAT team have recommended.
Yeah, I don't know if they've taken formal action, because
No,
I think
but
they're
I'm
in the
just saying
exact same,
their
yes.
reaction.
I think they're in the same
Positive.
moment you are as evaluating, but yes,
Yes.
I think that's fair. They're generally in agreement, for sure. And again, as Scott said on this development incentives, I won't park on these long because I think he's
No,
going
you're
to
fine. I
speak to
just
them.
wanted to kind of get a timeline
Yeah,
there,
yeah.
next steps.
Really, this speaks to kind of previous discussion and really proposals around, particularly your TIF policy, but then also is baked into your CID policy. And the distinction between the first two, I think, is important. So in your proposed policy and your TIF policy, you have kind of some criteria that looks for, it kind of does it on a 25%, no more than 25% of the investment, the public investment will exceed the total project cost or the total investment. That's a fairly common tool that a lot of cities use to kind of look at, and I've tried to, in this depiction, kind of tie it back to kind of that rate of return or that ratio that we're used to seeing, in this case, private to public ratio. So the math is switched and inverted, but the point is still the same of kind of what's that maximum. So that what the first one means is kind of maintain what your current policy has on the amount of private dollars that are committed to a project versus the public dollars. 2 to 1, a 2 to 1 in return that you all receive that the private sector is putting into their project versus the incentivized dollars that are matched or are included. But for looking at a lower standard, 2 to 1, when we would consider projects that are both TIF and CID. A number of our competing communities across Kansas layer the incentives. Look at a consideration to say, if we were to do both TIF and CID, the way our tax structure works with sales tax in this county, that limits the amount of opportunities that we can do that on, but there have been some projects, certainly star bond projects, the city staff will talk about that we've done that. But were we to have projects going forward that theoretically could use both tools, what if that standard was a little bit different? Ostensibly, that's because if the project needs both tools, if it's such a scale that needs both tools, it's more than likely to be highly competitive, and it's likely to have a gap sufficient to where it could use a different standard. So that was really the discussion that the task force had around, if you were to look at layering the incentives, what would that look like? And then adjust the ratio of private to public benefit, again, kind of a higher standard, more investment if you're looking at just TIF or just CID. These match up fairly close to what's in your policy today. Really, the distinction is that consideration of if we were to consider layering the incentives and using them together. Removing restrictions in your policy and some of the proposed policies from previous years. One of the big things that, sure.
On the slide, the first bullet point says TIF or, shouldn't that say TIF and?
Yes, it should. Sorry, good
Okay.
catch.
Just to be clear.
Yes, TIF and. Thank you for that.
For both bullets.
No, just the
Just
first
the
one.
top
Just the
one.
first,
Yeah,
that's the
yeah.
distinction,
Yep,
yes.
yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Below, what a number of communities across the state do in terms of TIF projects, and they don't always do it on every project, but they do consider an eligible expense. Obviously, under TIF law, there's only certain things by state statute you can apply those TIF proceeds, those TIF revenues, to reimburse for or to pay off the bonds for. And many communities look at land acquisition as something that is reimbursable. This policy, and your previous policy, has not looked at that and has precluded land acquisition. So that's
I can
something.
probably say that almost every project that we work on, especially from somebody from the outside, we get beat up on this, on land acquisition.
Right.
And one of the first things I noticed when I came here too, and my question is there may very well be on a case-by-case basis where that shouldn't be allowed, but why? Why would we stop at the outset? The other thing, again, the maximum term of these two tools of TIF and CID, there are other development incentives, but the most common in Kansas are TIF and CID. The benefit term are 20 years for TIF and 22 years for CID. We would maintain and recommend to keep the maximum term. Again, providing you as counsel on a case-by-case basis. If that needs to be limited, then you have that ability to do that then. And then certainly tenancy restrictions is probably the most debated and discussed and controversial element of many TIF projects, of when it's usually a retail or a commercial development project, and those are filled up with tenants, generally speaking. And when there's a TIF project, that's usually new construction, so there's a shiny new building on this corner, and you have a tenant that relocates and decides, I don't want to be in the older building anymore, I want to be in that new project, that new project was built and subsidized with public dollars. What's the right restrictions and preclusions and approach to that from a public policy standpoint that limits that? So we would argue, instead of kind of having a hard and fast rule across the board, that's on a case-by-case basis to provide some flexibility. So that was really kind of the depth that we were able to get to on development incentives. Again, we kind of parked the vast majority of our recommendations on tax abatement. So, questions for me? I think that's the last of my, yep. Well, thank you for allowing me to kind of share some perspective. Cindy? Sure.
I do have a question. On the tenancy restrictions, would the document have any sorts of guidelines, or would it just, or are you just, is the committee just suggesting, no, just say it's on a per project basis?
At this juncture, our committee, our task force was saying it's on a project basis. We could certainly understand and recognize that having some direction, some guidelines of what that looks like, or a goal. I love the way Scott talks about guidelines. These are what we're shooting for, but again, provides you all that flexibility would certainly be supported.
But the trade-off is sometimes when you just put guidelines in, people take them as hard and fast too.
Sure,
So it's like,
sure.
you say on a per project, and it is
Well,
truly on a per
Right,
project.
and you do have past practice. I mean, we've been
Yeah.
using prior projects as our guidelines, right? There's not one standard you used.
Thanks.
Well, thank you all. I could sit over and talk all day about economic incentives, so I appreciate you guys letting me go on at
Thank
the
you,
time.
Andrew.
So.
Thank you, Andrew.
Do you want to take a 5-minute break, or do you want to keep moving?
Already took mine.
Yeah, I think,
I could,
Just keep going?
yeah, that's fine. I'm just gonna
Okay.
go take one.
Take 5,
We'll take
a
1.
one-function break.
Yes.
because yeah, we're missing one right now too, so maybe he'll be back within the 5. So,
Okay.
that was tasty. Thank you.
My pleasure. Makes your teeth wiggle, it's so sweet.
I'm gonna let ladies go first.
We got some.
No, she's talking about the bathroom.
Oh, sorry. Well, I can go in the
The one
hallway.
function.
My one function.
So we didn't talk about this, but Joplin just introduced $1 billion incentive package for Tesla.
A billion?
Yeah, now it's some overinflated numbers, but still, I mean, they got a little traction because of their package that they put together. And that's why the tack that they took with this one, really focusing on our workforce,
Yeah.
And the infrastructure we have in place already, the abilities of our Yeah, and I think being in a position with these adjustments to our incentive policy allows us to be ready for people that are looking to make changes or do things differently because of the COVID, right?
Well, the mayor said it right, because these are guidelines that are established, right? And so now, as you have changing conditions, you can take that into account. I think that's exactly right.
I don't hear that a lot. What was that?
You go ahead, just one more time.
Oh, you missed. We had a whole conversation while you were gone.
Oh, I meant the other Brandon. Okay, Scott.
We ready? Thanks, Andrew, and I don't know if Jeff is still on, but thanks for that information. Great to hear the consensus to move forward with those ADDI recommendations. What I would say is we've already incorporated those into the design guidelines, to the economic development guidelines. So if you were to read through the document, you would see already those tenets embedded within the 1.1, the matrix. Sue Mander kind of stole my thunder about the example about the matrix of how we'd evaluate projects. So we're not going to spend time reviewing those, but I just want to let you know we're coming forward as soon as we get feedback today. We'll work to incorporate any changes that or suggestions coming out of this discussion today into a new proposed guideline document that we bring forward for city and hopefully county consideration. The last time, just an update, that we updated this document was 2012. So you can think how much the world has changed just in those eight years. So one of the things that we talked about is adding a community and workforce development section to the document to encourage the consideration of projects that tie in to the needs of the city, whether they deal with high poverty, high employment, vacant structures. So we talk with businesses, whether they're building a new structure or potentially locating in an existing building. Is there consideration for that company or encouraging that company to consider moving into those, I'll call it challenged areas or vacant structures that could have a broader benefit or halo benefit to the opportunity, as well as certain populations, whether it be ban the box type of discussions or chronically unemployed. Are we, instead of considering it an exception consideration for a project, is encouraging them to consider those locations? So if you have your memo, the memo to council, what this document does, and instead of going page by page to the guidelines, it simply highlights to the respective sections of incentives the changes that we're recommending or proposing to be discussed for each of those sections. So for the first one, downtown incentives, in the past, we have talked about the process that a project that's going through the downtown or proposing to be in the downtown, if they utilize TIF or STAR bonds, then they go through this process. It doesn't set out that process in depth, so what we're trying to say in this section is for the development agreement, that it will set certain minimum guidelines, certain minimum milestones. So the goal is if we approve a project, I think the council has been very clear in the past several years that if we approve a project, we want to see the project move forward, not approve a project and wait to see something down the line happen.
Do we need to adjust the downtown mapping because of the east bank of the river, west bank of the river now? Or does it need to stay as it is defined now?
I think that's really a council discussion. I know the community discussed it. I know the partnership and the downtown development community discussed that. Where are those boundaries for downtown?
We have considered the West Bank to be part of downtown for planning purposes. What we haven't, but it's also part of Delano, right? It's so, but when we talk about the downtown boundaries, I think you were talking about the SMID boundaries. And so it's not incorporated into the SMID. And that would take a legal process. And we've not talked to Jeff or to the downtown development corp.
There is a little overlap if the document name just escaped me, the downtown
master plan. There
are some catalyst sites that are outside of the SMID area. The Delano site was one of those that are technically outside the SMID that the Downtown Review Committee looks at. But we don't have a hard to define boundary currently in the guidelines. So if the council wants to consider
we can look at that. Not in SMID boundary, but let me look at at least the downtown master plan.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're going to do this, we might as well maybe adjust it if needed.
Absolutely. The other thing we're proposing, we've been doing this just on a case-by-case basis, is as we consider these major projects in the downtown, this takes extensive time for not only internal legal, but outside legal review, bond counsel, external consultants. We get the Downtown Review Committee involved for a number of meetings reviewing that. We're simply wanting to codify in this document that a project that comes forward that requests a TIF or a CID, those major projects, especially as Andrew talked about, have multiple incentive proposals, that there would be a deposit for that project, and that the project would then charge against that deposit. If there's any remaining funds after the project is through council, then that would be remitted back to the council. So, for example, if a project only used $5,000, then the remaining $5,000 goes back to the developer. We already talked briefly about this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time about this, but one of the key things that we want to include is, Addie suggested a number of items, but as staff, we talked about, are there other potential carrots or incentives that we would encourage development? So one of them would be sustainable development, alternative energy use. Are we encouraging our businesses, as they consider new developments or new structures, are they using sustainable development measures, whether to conserve water usage, use energy such as solar or wind in their development? Is that an opportunity to encourage that type of use? And additionally, community workforce development benefits. So as those companies come forward, what are they doing not just to build their facility, what are they doing to have that greater halo effect around the development? Are they agreeing to hire, just for example, as an idea, high school graduates coming out of that area to work with those youth to accrue internships or summer employment opportunities? And these would be not just, yes, I'm going to do this, but what are you putting in writing that you're saying we're committing to? If we're going to hire those disadvantaged workers, what is that percentage of your 100 employees? Are you committing 25% of that? Great. Then at that 5-year review, how are you doing not only on your total hiring, but of that percentage you said you were going to do? I'm not going to go through the example over again, but this is just more of that. One of the key things that we, in the past, is we talk about our large OEMs like Spirit or Textron or Bombardier, others. A lot of these larger companies do these 5-year capital investments of a certain amount of dollars. And what they're doing is often not building a new building, but they're redoing their HVAC system. They're improving their processes, windows, so they're more energy efficient. So we do an IRB letter of intent for usually a 10-year process. There's typically not a job assigned to that job amount growth. It's strictly a capital investment. And the goal in the past has been, as we see those capital investments by those large companies, that just means they're setting deeper roots into our community. So we found that's great for the larger companies. We're trying to figure out how can we ratchet that down to maybe some of our smaller or mid-sized companies who maybe in the past this had been a $50 million commitment. So for a large company that would be reasonable, but how do we bring that lower? So a mid-tier, whether it be an aero supplier or some other, to say, yeah, we're willing to do that 5-year commitment of at least $25 million, that they get a 10-year abatement versus struggling to get a 5 and 5 and having to have a job commitment if they're simply doing facility improvements and not building a new facility.
So are you comfortable, before we move to
Yes.
spec development, are we comfortable with the recommendations on tax abatement, especially the use of sustainable development and alternative energy as a criteria, and then the community and workforce development, which is outlined in a little more detail previous slide?
Question.
Thank you.
Do we have a fiscal note where these changes will be?
We'd I don't know that we could determine what the value of that would be unless we had projects to, I mean, we can include that as part of the evaluation of a project. So we can do a fiscal note for each one to tell you what that rate would be, what the value would be.
Is there then like a limit on how much, like we're budgeting this much for this? Like when I was the ranking member on a Commerce, Labor, and Economic Development Committee, we would have an incentive, but it was pretty much wouldn't exceed this, so, you know, this amount, like, there's a fiscal note attached to it that if we did this or that, it could, this is the projection that we thought it would cost, but this is what, you know, actually the floor was, so I don't,
Yeah, you'll
just
have
wonder if we have
multiple-
those as
yeah,
well.
So you'll have multiple criteria that I think will address that, Mayor. You've got the 3-to-1, if we're dealing with a TIF project, right? So there's got to be a private investment of 3 to every public dollar, so you got that first. The 1-to-1 return on investment, and then you
The
can't go
additional
any higher than
considerations.
100% here.
So I know, I understand that.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm just asking a question wrong. I mean, we've been at this for a few hours now, so bear with me. Like, I understand that each project is going to have its own fiscal note.
Right.
We're making global changes to the policy based on the projection of activity that we've done in the past towards our economic goals in the future. I'm wondering what, some of these incentives only come if they create jobs. Some of them kind of pay for themselves, some of them don't. That's what I'm kind of wondering is bottom line stuff, getting into our budget debates too, where we got to make investments while also be able to utilize, you know, the services we have. So I'm just wondering if that what analysis was created on globally, the last change I think went through with, and then this one, is there going to be a projection how much more this might cost us out of our general budget? And it seems like that we don't have that right now, so I can go offline and talk to you about that when we get a chance. I'm not trying to put anyone on a spot. I was just wondering if that was thought of.
Yeah, probably the best way to do is capture projects over some past period of time and tell you what that would have done.
Like a projection based, okay.
Yeah.
And actually, Mayor, your annual report that we provide on the side there, if you want to see the past history of our industrial revenue bond projects or EDX projects or TIF projects, it'll actually show you when they were initiated, how many jobs they've created to date, and when they're supposed to fall back on the tax rolls, and what that tax impact will be when they come back on the tax rolls. So it'll show in the appendix for IRBs, for example, what projects will be coming back on the tax rolls at the end of this year. It'll give a monetary amount that'll be new, I'll call it new dollars to actually hit the tax rolls for the community. So if there was a project XYZ that the 10-year abatement comes off in 2021, it'll have a note saying the annual impact to the city will now be an additional $25,000 in property tax. So that annual report in the appendix, it'll show each of our approved CIDs, TIFs, industrial revenue bonds, EDXs. It'll provide you what district they're in, when they started, when they end. So.
Thank you. I was looking at this earlier. I was cheating, and like I may sleep with this under my pillow. This is
okay.
good stuff. So, and thank you for breaking it down by district, because this way we can reach out to these companies, these industries, and say thank you for investing. And you know, so this is good
Yeah, I know
stuff.
oftentimes
Thank
we get questions from council members in the public, where is that CID district, or what is that Star Bond district? We've tried to put maps in as well to say this is the Union Station TIF district, this is this district. Allows you now to be able to see that and then to calculate what was that agreement we did for this project, and we'll be able to lay that out. One of the key things we hear is 2 years ago, in end of 2017, we initiated a spec industrial building program. And the challenge we had is we went, Andrew and Jeff and us went to several different markets to talk to site selectors and national brokers about why Wichita would be a great opportunity. One of the things, it was a pretty stark comment we heard from a number of them saying, we simply don't think about Wichita. And the second part is the lack of available inventory to meet their needs for their clients. What you see in today's world is if there's a project, the project typically wants to be able to move in to build a suit building ready to go versus having to wait 12 to 13 months to build a new building. Just time of instance is critical today. So the council approved back in 2017 a spec industrial program. Projects have to start a minimum of 100,000 square feet. It provides a 95% abatement for the first 5 years and 50% abatement for the second 5 years if they hit certain performance marks as far as occupancy. To date, we have 3 of those projects completed, which is approximately 350,000 square feet, and leasing is going well on those. We have yet to see a flex building, which is kind of an industrial office building combination you'll see. The other challenge we've had, and fortunately we've seen a couple of recent buildings coming on board that do have some limited Class A office space, is a lack of, I'll call it bigger Class A office space, whether it be in the downtown or elsewhere, that Andrew and his team can go out and recruit. And this is one of the challenges we have in our current guidelines is we are very manufacturing, build a new building, hire so many new employees, and we'll give you a tax abatement. But what do you do for a company that simply says, I'm a division of company XYZ, I'm considering bringing 50 engineers to town, I don't need a building, I'm just looking for space. So first you have to have the space available, and then is it a reasonable lease rate? So the idea behind this is to have a Class A office spec program. The idea is to encourage spec development of Class A office space, and that's typically when we see projects come through our doors and through Greater Wichita Partnership, they're generally coming for Class A office space. Some companies love redevelopment of old buildings, but old buildings have sometimes challenges for a business plan for some companies who maybe want an open floor plan or different needs. So the opportunity to have some Class A office space. So the idea would be a minimum 60,000 square foot building. We don't put any perspectives of where that location would be. That could be a discussion point for further consideration. And then one of the questions we have heard is in the spec industrial program is what we don't want to do is create an opportunity for businesses to hop around. Is do we put a minimum lease size, and 7,500 square feet is our initial discussion point because we think that's reasonable. That's about 50 employees you could probably handle in that. That may change now with COVID and the spacing, but generally it's about 64 to 80 square feet per person if you think of a cubicle type of aspect. And so there could be special bonuses and considerations for the downtown. So we wanted to bring that discussion up. It's one of the things that we see an opportunity that could be an opportunity to additionally market Wichita, but also how do we encourage businesses who may not need a building, but how do we encourage a person who builds buildings to build that type of building? So if you do that incentive, that provides an early opportunity for maybe to drive down that lease price to make it attractive for that business who may be considering Tulsa or Oklahoma City or other places.
Scott, remind me,
Sure.
on the industrial flex building, do we have tenancy restrictions on that?
We do. The
Okay.
minimum breakdown is 25,000 square feet. In a 100,000 square foot building, no less than 25% of that building can be in a specific lease. So for example, if I have a 100,000 square foot building, they need to have each of those tenants be a minimum of 25,000 square feet.
So someone could still move, they can move across town, but they have to take 25,000
Yeah,
square feet
it's a
at
pretty big
minimum.
space.
And that's what we're trying to
Yes.
replicate here, but
Yeah.
for Class A. Okay,
And it does encourage expansion
right.
Yeah.
in town too, instead of out of town.
Thoughts?
I would just add from our perspective, the partnership, this would be highly attractive. I mean, we're very fortunate that we've had some activity in the kind of office space sector, and we've had some redevelopment of some office buildings and certainly more to come. But there are some clients that want to look at truly Class A new buildings. And while we've had some new construction and some proposed on the horizon, having a tool like this will help us go after maybe those companies that they're only exclusively looking at the brand-new Class A in Dallas or in Kansas City, so this would be helpful.
When we started the discussion, this was before the whole COVID situation, but even in the discussion we had just in the last 5-10 minutes about, is there an opportunity to bring office users who may be in a more dense situation on the East Coast or coast to more of a Midwest? Here's an opportunity to provide Class A office space.
So as we're thinking big, the last time we had anything massive built downtown was probably, the biggest thing would probably be Cargill, as far as brand new, which was nice. And that was downtown area. Are these businesses looking at any particular part of town, or just, hey, where's the opportunity?
I think some of them look downtown. The other classic place that they look at, and Andrew can jump in, is not Waterwalk, Waterfront.
Mm-hmm.
Is more of a Class A business park atmosphere.
Sure.
A lot of those Class A users want to look at not just fine finishes in their buildings, but what are the amenities around it, whether it be restaurants or evening activities.
I would agree.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about how do we entice our good friend Phil Ruffin to build the twin that was supposed to be for the Epic Center, right? Not necessarily, but, thinking about some of that sort of thing. Devon Energy, in Oklahoma City did something obviously very impressive, although that's oil, lots of oil money. Just thinking in that direction.
And the one last piece I would thread into this conversation would be all of it matters, all across our community. The ability for any of the users that might pay the rents to go into a facility like that, it's about talent. It's about creating an environment where they can attract the talent of the highly skilled professionals that they need. And so all of our amenities across our community play into that for sure. And we can have those in multiple locations, whether it's a downtown location, a suburban location, but it's always a talent play from their perspective.
Within our downtown, we don't have a lot of vacant multi-story buildings
We
anymore.
don't.
They've all either been redeveloped or have projects in the works. We have a lot of vacant asphalt parking lots that could have Class A office really well, if there were some specials or bonuses for that, so.
I don't know that the incentives will have to be overly robust. I think it's just enough to get to a tipping point. TGC built their building. It was initially to be all spec until they landed a major tenant. And Jack DeBoer's talking about additional office in Water Walk in addition to the tower that he's talking about. But he's cautious in terms of moving forward, and so that's why.
And that's the difference is there are some Class A buildings being built, but they're being built just as market needs versus a speculative. How do you get out in front? So if that opportunity arises, we can immediately respond versus we can have a building built in 12 months.
Oh, God, we're talking about
And that doesn't cut it, because in 12 months, there's 6 or 7 options in Kansas City and 50 in Dallas.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I'm glad we're talking about those options. We're talking a lot about spec industrial space and land for bringing those types of businesses here, but we have, Councilmember Fry said it, we have a lot of vacant lots downtown that are buildable.
Yeah.
So. An additional item, we've heard this from another of IRB EDX clients, is one of the concerns. Our current program is there's a job requirement. Let's just say it's 100 jobs they need to provide over the 10-year process. So at the 5-year review, we come to them and say, how are you doing? Did you reach the 100 jobs? And they say we've reached 90. Our current policy says council can choose to put them back on the tax rolls and seek those back taxes that they received a waiver for because they didn't hit the full 100 jobs. What this is proposing, if they reach, for example, 90 jobs out of the 100, instead of being able for the council to punitively go after the full 100% abatement for those first 5 years, is to do it proportional. So they pay the 10% that turns between 90 jobs and 100 jobs of that tax abatement. So just for example, if the tax abatement was $1,000 a year, 10% they would be required to pay back.
I have a question, and I'm sorry, I can't remember the company, I can't. But if somebody can, once I explain it, jump in. But they did not meet the job requirements. Let's say they were gonna have 50 new jobs and they had 40, but they made a shift in their business model, so the jobs that they did get were higher wage. So it ended up being actually more advantageous for them and for the city. So, I think there needs to be a little bit of flexibility too. If it's not just, well, you said you're gonna get 100 jobs and you have to get 100 jobs. If you said you're gonna get 100, but you get 80 and they're higher wage because you made a change, that needs to be taken into consideration.
And I would add to that your staff and your policy has been, your history has been, you've done just that very thing. Now, thankfully, you haven't had too many projects where you've had to make an accommodation or make a clawback. You've had very few by comparison. But what Scott is speaking to is that language in the policy today jumps out and it screams at the companies, especially if they have legal counsel. And they say, wait a minute, there's even a remote chance that my client might have to pay all of it? Whoa, and it locks them up. And so this is about kind of presenting and projecting forward as much as, certainly we want to be good stewards of the resources, but at the same time, the way the policy is written really scares some companies off
Yeah,
sometimes.
absolutely.
Just lastly, we currently don't have an IRB application fee. We do have one for EDX, which is kind of interesting because they're very similar programs. We're just simply asking to cover staff and legal costs, a simple application fee for $2,500. And for strictly construction sales tax exemptions, just $1,000. And that's to cover staff time and legal fees and bond counsel and notice of mailings for that. And then also we've updated this section to include the sectors identified for regional growth plan. Community improvement districts. Back in 2018, we had a very robust discussion about community improvement districts. This is probably the incentive that we probably get a lot of discussion about, both in the community as well as council members and different groups. One of the things we're recommending in this is coming out of 2018 is that council back in 2018 wanted to look at a stratification of CID benefits based on where you locate, what type of project are you doing, are you hiring certain people? So we wanted to have that discussion a little bit more today. We've taken some opportunities to discuss this, whether we want to consider a stratification, considering such things as urban, suburban, redevelopment, greenfield. There may be different thoughts about whether it's a greenfield site and a very highly attractive retail area versus, let's say, an opportunity zone that's struggling to get a grocery store or a certain type of amenity in that area. Is there a variable on that? There's some people that argue that, hey, if it's going to a hot area of town, why do you need to provide additional benefit versus how do we encourage them to consider other locations? And that can go into, do you do a longer, whether it's you can have up to 22 years, but maybe you adjust that if it's a greenfield site and we still think it's worthwhile, but maybe it's not a full 22 years. So we just want to go through an idea that we want to have some discussion. Again, location, minimum capital investment. If it's a small project, what does that mean? That may have a variable if it's in an opportunity zone, for example. We may not want to discourage it. We might want to encourage it, even though it's a smaller project, but it's going into a certain area of town that we're willing to have a greater investment in there. Address blight and high-level design finishes. So for Greenfield, the discussion back in 2018 is, were a council to consider a CID, do we know the tenants? Or is it, I'll call it a spec CID project? Hey, we want to do a new shopping center, but we don't know the tenants. Do we have a unique design? Do we want to have a specific retailer that's kind of the anchor of why do we want to consider a CID? It's, Cheesecake Factory was the one that always people kind of talk to me about. Is that a factor we say we want to consider it if we want to bring that type of use to Wichita? Is it a destination entertainment? Is it retail tourism? And so those are things that 2018 council talked about for greenfield development consideration. We can talk a little about redevelopment. The thought process is to lean heavier on a greater percentage and a longer distance, longer duration to encourage redevelopment areas. So this is the concept that staff has had some discussion with various council members over the years is, for example, if it's a CID project that's under $5 million and it's a greenfield site, maybe they only get 1% of the CID. If it's a greater percentage, you can see the ratio, maybe it jumps up. And the idea is that greater investment, that greater sales tax generation to the community overall maybe justifies that bigger investment. One of the key things we have done in the city over the last few years is we retain 10% of the CID revenue to assist either in a district, and we now, in the last few years, try to go out into the street to take into the street, so if we need to do future street improvements, or to use that 10% to do park maintenance. One of the concepts, I think Councilmember Johnson threw this out 2 years ago, is there an opportunity to use those 10% dollars of CIDs, not just in with that specific district, because it's pretty small, it has to be adjacent to the parcel being developed. Is it an opportunity to redistribute that into maybe blighted areas or to other areas of town that maybe don't have that direct impact, but that could utilize those funds? So talking with legal and bond counsel on that, the discussion has been what we call an origination fee. So the way it typically works is let's say for the life of that CID, it was gonna generate $2 million, 10% of that would be $200,000 to the city, is that the developer would agree that that 10% is paid on an annual basis, regardless of whether they generate their full revenue or not. And that allows us then to move those dollars around the community for benefit. It's a pretty novel approach. We don't know of another city in Kansas that really does this, but this is the idea is what is the community benefit for a CID other than just immediately those parcels that CID is located in. Could it be an opportunity to fix sidewalks in another part of town that maybe lack that? We could move those dollars around. It's a concept. We've been very successful. Nobody really brings up the issue about the 10% to retain for city usage in the immediate district. The discussion we're trying to now encourage is do we want to consider this origination fee opportunity? And then we are agreeing to the adage recommendation is the public to private investment is 3-to-1. So with that, we can stop and have some discussion.
Scott, give an example again of that, retaining the 10% and using it somewhere else. You had an example.
Sure. So CID goes in, just pick an intersection.
Yeah.
And it's, over the life of that 22 years, it's going to generate $2 million worth of CID revenue. We retain 10%. Currently, we can use that 10% within that district. The idea of this is having the developer pay an origination fee allows us then to take that 10%, usually paid on an annual basis, so $2 million spread over 22 years, whatever that annual basis is, allows us to move those dollars outside of the district to another part of town.
A good example is chicken and pickle. We were limited in the amount, in the improvements we could make. So we were primarily going to do it at intersection improvements and maybe turn lanes that weren't required of the developer. But it was a struggle. And I think that's what led to that question.
So I understand that. My question is it guaranteed? I mean, because you're saying it's an origination fee.
It's different than what is generation. Okay. So if I only generate $1,000 in that CID this past year, then it would be 10% of that $1,000. But if the projection, when you came to council and said I was going to generate $2 million over 22 years and the annual amount would be $10,000, then the agreement would be you pay us $10,000 regardless of whether you generate it or not.
So it's a guaranteed.
It's a guarantee.
Anywhere. Okay.
Normally what we do though is establish a maximum, right?
Yep.
In that CID.
Correct.
So we may not want to peg it that. We may negotiate a different origination fee, right?
Yeah.
What I often find in this discussion is it generates the discussions of the developer to be more realistic in their projections of the CID. You'll see in the annual report, if you go into some of the early CIDs years ago, there was an outside of many, many millions of dollars versus what probably realistic is going to happen because there was not a cap on what could be generated. This is a way for development to be more realistic. It's an opportunity for us to redistribute those CIDs to better surrounding areas.
Can I ask a question, Scott?
Sure.
And kudos, Councilmember Johnson. I love out-of-the-box thinking, and you're always a great thinker and always thinking of the whole community, so thank you. So let's say then, is there a project list or a prioritization of how does, who decides where the money goes or how the money goes? Is it, we're gonna try and help opportunity zones for, I'm curious, I'm asking a question I don't know the answer to. I mean, how do we determine?
I don't think we know that yet.
Okay.
Councilmember Johnson gave us 10 projects in District 1.
I was just gonna say,
Maybe
I think
25.
I know.
Just this week, I got 5 from him. No, I'm just kidding.
But, I'm thinking there's places for people, there's opportunity zones. I mean, there's so many places
There's a lot
that
of
we can
need.
peg this into to help support projects that are existing. So that's why I'm just excited. I'm asking questions because I'm excited.
The other argument to that is, well, why not just do a citywide sales tax instead of a CID by district and allow that money to be used however you want, wherever you want? I mean, that's some of the other arguments that I hear.
Right.
So, because we have so many CID districts as it is. I just duplicated myself. We have so many CIDs as it is, so.
The way law and bond counsel explained to me is those dollars would go into a separate fund that then the city could have the ability to allocate as it sees fit, ideally for neighborhood projects.
So we'd want to have some sort of criteria.
Pretty tight criteria.
Of how projects get funded and which projects get funded. Yeah.
Sounds like a great opportunity, though.
Yeah, yeah, I love the idea. I do. Figuring out, okay, I mean, what Brian's saying is, you know,
Well, and then you also get into on the greenfield, you know, who's deciding who's unique and picking winners?
Yeah.
I mean, just because you want a Cheesecake Factory, someone else may want a Bass Pro.
right,
Or something else.
Yeah, no,
And so
true.
now, then we have to decide
what's unique.
who's worthy of the uniqueness.
Yeah.
That's hard.
That's hard. I mean, that's what we got in trouble with on the sales tax issue in 14 because of the picking in the winners and losers, so.
Yeah, it is a great point, because as we looked at this, you'd have to really get into the details of what is that unique retailer, what is that location
And that's-
versus, currently we do it on a case-by-case basis, and there's a lot of negotiation. You can continue to do that, and if we set certain parameters, hey, we're gonna do the origination fee, that's a key, that eliminates a little discussion, because that then allows council to say, we're already gonna get that 10%, we can allocate it as we see fit, versus going into, is this project worthwhile, is it within these certain areas? But you may wanna do that, especially for redevelopment areas, to say, we definitely wanna provide additional bonus for those certain areas to encourage that reinvestment.
I like it.
Just figure it out.
Is there any limit to how many of these would be offering a year or a standard? Because I see that if we lower the numeric qualifications before it gets to the council, and if we don't, and I don't know, maybe the overall strategy is coming up, but if we don't have a overall strategy to piggyback on what the council member said, where, you know, some people might want retail, some people might want restaurants, then it almost seems like it's just gonna come case by case, up when it comes up, and then if we did it for this person, why aren't we gonna do it for that person? And then, you know, is there any other strategy or limitation on how many of these we're gonna do a year, how many we're going to do within certain districts? Like, is there anything moving forward that we've done in the past that we can kind of work on, or is it going to be pretty much if you get in front of the council, then, you know, we'll consider you, and it's kind of first, you know, whoever's able to make it through that process.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's, the way it was approved by the legislature originally was pretty wide open.
What year was that?
That would have been in 2010, maybe?
Yeah, I was gonna say
9 or
2000,
10?
yeah,
All right, say what you want about then. Yeah, go ahead.
And it was modeled after what was done in Missouri. It was to help projects that were hamstrung because of the recession, right? It was to jumpstart the economy. Over time, the council has narrowed the uses allowed for that reason, I think, to make sure that it wasn't wide open. And so it's been primarily for redevelopment projects, where and there has to be a stated public purpose, which is what the 10% goes towards. It's been for downtown hotels and unique retailers, unique to the region. I think that's pretty much where we've been. Council, that's,
Yeah.
I don't think there's any other criteria that have allowed the CIDs, right?
I think the only other, I'll call it larger one, was out the K-96 area to help kick off that area.
Yeah,
That's a much bigger,
Yeah.
call it regional type of project than just a specific parcel. It was.
But Cabela's was unique to the region.
Right.
I suppose that was the
It all-
outlier, even though we had a gander.
Yeah, it also, yeah, but it also helped pay for the interchange.
Sure.
That was
That
our
was the public
issue.
improvement, yeah.
And it's supposed to be but for financing. I mean, you know, I mean, it's not like we just, we're not taking this money out of the general fund, and the project has to generate it, and
Sure.
it has to be that the project wouldn't happen but for
Correct.
this financing.
There's eligible uses that we require, and then what we encourage is we talk to either specific tenants who are seeking those or developers, is the goal is to not use the CID revenues that they receive to go recruit companies. It is to do improvements to build the development, not to use to entice company XYZ to locate in there. And that's the difference between a speculative CID versus we have a tenant in tow, we have these users, so we know it's a real project, versus we're gonna use this to lure others to the area.
And when
This
you
is
say
a
Laurel,
good
you mean
example.
retailers.
Yes.
Retailers.
Mayor, this is the exact opposite of what the question you were asking before. This is one where we are a lot more restrictive than others in the state.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just worry about the idea of the I'm just wondering strategy-wise, where I understand CIDs, I understand the Vice Mayor's comment about how this is targeted, it's a tax increase, and it's one district. It's not coming out of our general fund, but if we're looking over to develop some of the the areas of our town that are more at an economic disadvantage, by bringing something in that maybe an anchor, we've now just created a district where it costs more money to buy stuff in that area. So I think CIDs work really well when you're downtown, when you're doing kind of stuff that are extra. But are there other tools we could be utilizing as well? And is there, particularly with economically disadvantaged areas, has a study of CIDs shown to be harmful if utilized in certain areas that, because like I said, the whole district has to kind of pay for the project. And although it's not coming out of our general fund, it's coming from the project, that if one of the places you shop at happens to fall into that, then it costs more. So, and sales tax already is one of the worst in the country, to be quite honest.
Good example is Central and Oliver.
Mm-hmm.
There's a CID there on that.
CVS.
CVS, right. It's an impoverished area, but you're having to pay a higher sales tax for it.
Right, and that's, exactly, so.
There's not a lot of public improvement that was done there. The intersection was redone, but that's a one-time.
Right.
Good, and I'm glad that sometimes I ask questions and I'm not sure if I'm making my point, so I'm glad that was clear then. Yeah, that's my concern is when we talk about developing areas that I live in, or other areas of the city, which is seeing less development. One of the things that I hear from people is, why are you putting out development over here and not over here? And I think one of those answers is the tools we have, where if you build over here, where people have more expendable income and they buy more, then that district actually allows for increased revenue with sales tax than over. And we talked about winners and losers. I want to make sure that as we're looking at our incentives, is there a way that we can make certain adjustments, or at least be mindful of this, to see if we can get more development throughout.
Yeah, that's a great policy discussion, right?
Yeah.
Because that developer will tell you that he had a gap and he couldn't have gone forward with that project if it had not been for the CID.
Mm-hmm.
But you're right, I mean, it does add, I can't remember if that's a 1% or a 2%.
It's up to 2%.
Well, something to also
Pardon me?
consider.
Up to 2% for CID.
The
I'm
CVS
not
is
a specific
1%.
project.
yeah.
I can't remember.
CVS is 1%.
It's 1%.
Is it 1%?
Yeah.
Hey, Scott, could you go back to slide 24,
Yeah.
please? So this is where,
I haven't been there. I
this
saw
is
the
where we would
CVS.
address what the mayor's talking about, right? Like, we could put redevelopment areas, we could put specific locations in here. We could do things that encourage larger redevelopment projects, or address blight, or,
Sure.
I mean, this is I think what you're talking about, Mayor, is that if we want to direct based on.
Define some areas.
Yeah, then this is where we do it. We do it in our policy and think about what our strategy is. And we could do the same thing for Greenfield too. What is it that we as a city want to encourage, and this is where we do it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's what, and it's encouraging to hear that, because that's what, I think some of this, and like I said, I was up quite early with the kids, so bear with me, I feel like it's at 6 o'clock and it's only 3 o'clock. But earlier in this discussion, it was about, all right, how do we kind of widen the net? And then now, we also want to be more targeted. So I think we're all in agreement. That was my concern, and we could start having those discussions moving forward. I mean, maybe not right now because we're going through the presentation, but it would be nice to have those in the back of our mind.
One of the benefits, we would say, of the origination fee we just talked about, it somewhat addresses the concern of I don't want to have a CID in a certain area of town because it may be regressive on disadvantaged individuals that are paying 2% more for that milk or whatever that's desperately needed. There may be a value actually to incentivize that big box in a greenfield area, because they're going to generate so much more sales tax, and the 10% retention we would make offsets doing a CID in a redevelopment area and the burden it places on the residents, because we could move that 10% of origination fee and feed that into the redevelopment area to have a more of a direct impact. So there's a push and pull on that But the origination fees allows to have a benefit of a CID in a certain area, have a benefit in other areas that may not have that direct impact.
And if we do this right, it's a really good story, right?
Sure.
It's a really good story. And
Yeah,
that's
if you
what
went to
we're trying
council and said, we're gonna do this CID, and those funds will be targeted to fix sidewalks or whatever in certain
yeah.
areas,
Yeah.
the basis of support may increase for it.
Yeah, again, I just go back to my old argument. It's 90% of it's going into the developer's pocket, and he's using our taxing authority to be able to do that, he or she, by using that CID collection, and we're only getting 10% of it. So,
Well, but the CID also goes back into public infrastructure in that
10%.
development.
Yeah, but no.
90%.
No, Greenfield it wouldn't.
Oh,
It's
Greenfield.
pretty much all, area that's gonna get developed anyway, most likely.
So on the flip side of the coin, I've got, I know that we want to be very, and I'm on the same page as everybody, but there are, again, we talk about exceptions. There are exceptions to where there are maybe a food desert, maybe the cost to the resident or the citizen is more to have to travel further than it would be just to pay the 1%. Great examples of Broadway and Harry. I know 13th and Oliver is another example. If I had the opportunity to use the CID in those two areas, I think the benefit for the citizen would way outweigh the 1%, that they would be paying on their food bill because of the massive benefit of putting an oasis in a desert, and so when we're trying to look at blanket policies, we really need to be careful of that as well, so.
That's a really good point. That area had a supermarket for a while, and then when it didn't have a supermarket, it really went down.
It did.
And
it doesn't have it again, not because the supermarket wasn't making money, but there were some internal issues. But if I had the opportunity, absolutely. Especially since it was a low-cost grocery store.
Yeah.
So even with a 1%, they're still paying less than if they went to a Dillon's or something like that. So just a thought.
And the other aspect, CID might not be the end-all, use-all tool for that example. You may want
Sure.
to say, I don't want to do the full 2%. We're going to do a lesser amount because we don't want to impact that. But maybe the city decides there's other benefits we want to extend for that project because
Sure.
of a certain, those qualitative values that maybe don't get picked
Right,
up in the old
exactly.
matrix. So, just real quick, is this
I'm hearing we still have to do some work on CID.
Yes,
Yeah,
yes.
there's a lot more discussion, obviously.
As I said, this is the one where we had most of the discussion. We currently don't have any application fee for this, and as you can tell from this discussion, there is robust discussion with developers, citizens, that whole process. We have to notify everybody in a certain area. So there's a lot of staff and bond counsel and legal counsel that goes into this. So we're asking again for an application fee and a deposit fee. Again, deposit fee, if we don't use it, it goes right back to the developer. So
But we're not charging now?
no, there's no charge.
I thought we did.
So this is a 5,000 application plus a $5,000
Yeah.
development.
Deposit is, if you only use $1,000 of that, it goes right back to the
We're not
developer.
charging anything now for it?
Let me go back one
I
last
thought we
time.
charged 2,500.
yeah, 5,000 seems like kind of a jump from zero. Is that in line with something?
Every
I thought we
week,
had an application fee.
let me quick double check.
Or is that IRBs?
Well, definitely for IRBs, yes.
Scott, if you'd like me to jump in, I could on that.
That'd be great, Mark.
All right. It is currently a $5,000 fee, but what we're changing here is it was reimbursable through the revenue. So basically, the developer got that money back over time, and we're basically just saying it's non-refundable.
Okay.
You paid it, and the city goes forward with that. It's just no longer refundable.
Okay.
Sorry, that was my next note, so.
Thank you, voice of God.
All right, and then as Addie talked about, this has been a lot of the discussion as we consider CIDs, especially in the downtown area and certain other areas, is what we don't want to encourage is the jumping around of retail users to one CID, or I was in this one and not in this one, is we usually work on a case-by-case basis to set relocation restrictions. That currently isn't in the document. We are recommending that a statement be put into the document that the council have the ability to set those relocation restrictions on a case-by-case basis.
So before you jump on, Bob, are we going to revisit this conversation on CIDs at another retreat?
Yes.
And-
Yep.
Okay. I just want to flush out the whole origination fee.
Yep. TIF, we're almost done here, tax incremental financing. Again, we just want to state in the document that our preferred use of funds is for pay-as-you-go versus bonded. We have those, we've done very few bonded, and typically these are for infrastructure and public improvement of assets. We want to be very clear that the use of TIF funds are for public assets. And then a unique thing we found, sometimes our developers, community want to utilize the tax abatement value as their equity in their equation. So what we're trying to say is we really want to be the equity of the development, be the development, not the abatement that we're providing for the development. And then we want to clarify, if we do, and this is a discussion whether we want to do for pay-as-you-go and bonded, but we are definitely doing for bonded developer guarantee. So we want to make sure that there's always a backstop, especially if we do bonded TIF projects. There's been some discussion, do we want to encourage that for pay-as-you-go, especially if they're asking for public improvements. So, and then the last thing is Addie recommended, land acquisition has been kind of all over the board over the last few years. Some projects make an argument and have council adopt allowing land acquisition, others don't. We're suggesting it is identified as an eligible expense. Obviously, council always has the discretion during the negotiation to take the on or off.
Well, we've got examples of both right now.
Yep.
Okay.
And what we're trying to do is, and this is a key thing, is we've talked to investors, developers from outside the Wichita region, as they look at whether it's KC or Oklahoma City or other places where it currently is eligible. This is a factor in their consideration whether we do Wichita is land acquisition isn't available. Wow, that's quite a big hurdle for us to now additionally work through versus a typical project in other markets where they have opportunities to do those projects. So we're suggesting that it is an eligible expense.
Do you know what the thinking was when that decision was made, that land acquisition wouldn't be an eligible expense? Does anybody?
To be not ineligible?
Yeah, because it's not, now it's not an eligible expense. I'm just asking when that policy was put in place, do we know why that was put in place? It was before.
It predates me, so.
Predates you.
Yeah, I'm thinking that was part of the negotiations with the Minnesota guys.
Oh,
And I'm not sure that we had a firm policy before that time.
okay.
But it's been consistent
Probably kind
since
of
that
came out of
time.
that.
Yes.
Manager, this is Mark, or the voice of God again. It was back about 2010. It was kind of stemmed from the Minnesota guys, but a lot of it had to be, back then there were a lot more bonded projects, and there's a large concern from the public of basically the city borrowing money to buy land to then just directly give to a developer. Since then, with the pay-as-you-go and other ways that we've done to protect the city, I think that might have evolved away from that. But I think that was part of the original thinking when that policy was drafted. But it did have a lot to do with the Minnesota guys.
Thank you.
So again, if it's not a bonded, then
Yeah.
we're good.
I understand that.
Gotcha.
We just think it's an important consideration. As much as we attract talent and as much as we encourage our local developers to invest in the community, we want to bring new dollars in the community. And one of the criteria they're going to look at is if it's a TIF project and I can do a project in KC or Tulsa or Oklahoma City,
Right.
and we're not allowing land acquisition as an eligible expense, that is a key factor in their determination.
Okay, I have a really dumb question, but remind me. So TIF says infrastructure and public improvement assets.
deposit. We negotiate on a case-by-case basis for deposit. We're just trying to codify and make it uniform across the factor. Last, promised only one or two more slides. Just for awareness, STAR, this is sales tax and revenue. These are incredibly detailed projects. These are often not just months, but sometimes years. Projects, incredible amount of work that goes in with the state, with our partners. We are putting an application fee into that as well as deposit because so much time and effort is tied into that.
Let's just hope this is hypothetical.
Yeah. Yeah. And then we're simply recommending adopting the state guidelines for this. It just currently isn't in our guidelines at all. We're kind of silent on this. We're trying to include this into the document. And then facade, we currently don't have any fee. We're just asking a $1,000 fee to help cover legal fees and staff time associated with it.
That's the facade improvement.
Facade improvement project.
What are we at with how much is in that left remaining? Are we gonna have to look at some point?
Well, you can still do a facade special assessment without.
Oh, that's true.
That's true.
Without the grant. Yeah, that's true.
You're
Okay.
talking how much remains in the fund?
Yeah.
You can't, Mark, do you remember what's remaining in the fund?
But again, you're right.
Yeah.
You can still do it with
Right.
the special.
It's like 30,000 or?
It's roughly around 100,000, but
Oh, it's more than
I don't
that.
have the number in front of me for exact.
But
We should double check that because
Yeah.
I thought it was less than that, Mark.
we also had another project that was right outside the current boundaries of this facade
Right.
improvement program. And might want to take another look at that because the extension of the queue line along
Yep.
Douglas and how that has grown, there might be an opportunity to make sense to grow that along that same
Yeah,
stretch.
you could consider that, or you might want to consider, do we extend that to OZ zones or other areas
Right.
where we say, how do we
Right.
encourage that type of development? So we'll look at it as geographic.
Scott, this is a dumb question, but for facade, doesn't it have to be so many feet from the street to the building, correct?
Yes, the building structure has to be adjacent to the right-of-way.
Yeah.
So the challenge we usually run into, especially as we move into more suburban type development, is they'll have the road and then a parking lot.
Yes.
And then the structure, which throws that out.
And that was gonna be my question, is because in opportunity zones, that would be an issue, so that might be something to consider too, if we're looking at policy, that it not only extend, like for the Happiness Plaza or, wherever, but then also that restriction of from the street to the front door.
Yeah.
Councilmember Tuttle, if I can just, and Mark can correct me because he does facades process, that's a state requirement as far as adjacency. What we did do
I tried
is we utilized working with housing dollars to encourage in OZ zones, I'll call it small facade projects that may not qualify, even if the facade program were able to extend for OZ, but because of that parking lot situation is we identified, I believe it was $50,000 or $100,000 to leverage those small, I'll call it suburban type of retail establishments that may generate a need or a value for a facade project.
Thank you, I appreciate that, Scott.
Let's see. And then lastly, just a simple cleanup. We just want to make sure that all the documents are done, all the fees are paid before we go to city council for final action. We can be working on the project, just before we go to final council action, we want to make sure all the formal documents and fees are paid, so. With that, we'll take the information and feedback today, obviously some more work with CID especially and some other aspects, but we're open for questions.
Yeah, the good news is we're down to a much narrower list of items to bring back to you, so we're getting more resolution, which is great.
I have a question on something way back in the presentation. This is page 15 on the tax abatement project matrix about these additional consideration factors. So Addie suggested 5 things to us. Is that right? The regional growth plans?
Yep.
Okay. And then we added 2 additional that we could look at: sustainable development, alternative energy use, or community and workforce development
Yep.
benefits. So where did those come from?
We apply, because Audi said it was so critical to consider other community benefits, we applied a higher value to the 25%. It's entirely council discussion and discretion as far as how you want to move those values around. We just thought in an effort to encourage alternative energy use or conservation, we applied a little bit more than simply saying I'm in aerospace, which is part of the regional growth plan, I get 10%. So this is that next step up to how to encourage a different type of development that benefits the community as well as the company and as well as us, water consumption, electrical consumption.
Really came out of our discussion as a committee.
Okay.
Based off of the discussion that Addie had, and then we kind of took it to the next.
So it's encouraging a type of development is what we're trying to do.
Yeah.
Sustainable development, you know.
So if a project came forward and said, we're going to do, instead of a typical drainage area that's void of whatever, we do a bioswale that creates a green environment that's not a maintenance problem, but a maintenance benefit, but a beautification, as well as we're going to do solar on our roof, which is going to offset 50% of our load. There should be an encouragement to encourage that type of development.
Okay.
And then our definition for community workforce development would reflect what's on slide 12.
On slide 12.
And Scott, if you wouldn't mind, I would add to that your staff has done a really good job of looking to similar criteria when it comes to eligibility. They kind of refer to as kind of the Martin Interconnect clause or kind of approach was a previous tax amendment where they really looked at them from an eligibility standpoint, a wage standard and the 1.3 standard. They applied kind of this kind of approach of encouraging a company to hire disadvantaged workers on the eligibility. This takes it to the other side of the equation to where now that same approach, a company that's hiring the kind of workforce that we want to target and we want to work help, actually now equates to the benefit, equates to their percentage of tax amendment. So I think looking at it on both sides is a smart approach.
And again, the idea is not simply, they said they're going to do that, great, we'll forward it. It's, they need to document and say, what's our commitment? So when we bring it to council is, yes, they're doing sustainable development. What is that? That's part of the agreement that they're going to use, or we're going to hire a certain amount of our workers are going to be from this segment.
The other bullet point on sustainable energy, I think that ties back to a program that Evergy has, if I remember right.
And 80 referenced that in one of their reports. They didn't necessarily make it as explicit recommendation, but I would just argue and agree with you, staff, and that it definitely helps from a talent attraction standpoint. Having those more sustainable developments continues to be sought after, so I think it fits right in line.
So when this comes, if we adopted this and it came back to council, like jobs and capital investment are easy to see. Did it, didn't do it, easy. These will have to have pretty, like you said, they'll have to say what they're gonna do, and then, did you do it or not?
I call it, there's a quantitative review and there's a qualitative review.
Yeah.
The opportunity now is for council to consider both versus our present process is hard and fast. How many jobs, what's your wage,
Right.
what's your capital investment? We were encouraging council is, as Addie has recommended, is I'll call it the soft side of our project. Hey, if we're gonna hire 20 youth in a summer work program every year, or we're gonna participate with the United Way or Blue Cross Blue Shield for certain initiatives, is there a value for that? Are they going into a distressed area that may encourage other adjacent type of development?
So and they will also have to prove to us and, put the work back on them to qualify for those and get those incentives, so.
I wish I was gonna be around here for Martin Interconnect's 5-year review, because they're probably one of the fastest growing companies in our city right now.
Which company?
Martin Interconnect, the one that we're talking about, the exceptions, where they're hiring disadvantaged workers or those that are unemployable. And the other thing that I would want to think about when we're talking about the CID and using that 10% for other projects to help in low-income areas, one thing to also consider is when we're speaking about Martin Interconnect, they don't just train people to work in their factory, right? They train those people. They have a training program that nobody else is utilizing to train those people to work in other manufacturing in the city of Wichita. And so even utilizing some of that money to help those programs that are helping those people directly be employed by teaching them soft skills, teaching them kind of the resume writing and the things that they need coming out of prison, coming out of, treatment, whatever. A lot of those people don't have any of those skills, and they teach people those skills so they can go get a job at Spirit or Textron or anywhere else, and they're extremely successful at it. So if there was a way to take that 10% or any other program that's supposed to help disadvantaged areas of town, that would be an effective way to use that money as well.
I'd just like to make a couple comments. I want to first thank Andrew and Jeff for joining us today with the Greater Wichita Partnership. A lot of great work, and appreciate your answering all of our questions. And then also, I think we need to give a shout out to the SAT Task Force and all the community members and our own council members who are part of it. So thank you for that. And then just as we're looking at this global pandemic and economic crisis, there are industries that will be more successful at the other end of this. And so I would just encourage, if the task force keep meeting or the Greater Wichita Partnership, is to really look at industry trends and world and national trends of what is being successful and what industries are in some way benefiting from this, if you will, besides just making masks, because we know that's going to go away. But that should be a target that we have our eye clearly and keenly on, so that if there's opportunities for them to relocate or expand, that we have our finger on the pulse of what's going on. Because truly, there are industries that are more successful, not just IT and making masks, but other industries that are benefiting from this. So I hope we'll also keep our finger on that pulse as well.
Happy to, yeah.
So I love the origination fee, but I would like to have when we have our deeper dive, have council kind of put some guidelines around what that would mean. So like I can think of between grocery stores, sidewalks, our share roads that need to be redone, and in certain parts, like where funding could go, but like have council define what those needs are, and then maybe even more specific what the needy areas are. So I think about, as we talked about facade, Chester Selman has been talking to me about facades since 2018. He has that strip mall on 21st in Kansas, but he's set farther back than what would allow. So working with housing, that type of opportunity helps, but there's more Chester Selmans out there, and he has more properties like that could benefit. So having council come up with some guidelines, I think, for that would be great. And then what can we do to incentivize smaller businesses? So we've talked about the TGCs and like Occidentals, but what about people like Chester, like who may not have $5, 10, or $20 million to invest? He might have 30,000. What can we do to help them? Because any benefit that they get is truly going to help them. Like they really are. They really need that help. And today, like this was a great conversation. I just want to see us get smaller with our business help.
And I want to just echo that. My thought with this is that this was a lot of great information, but also coming out of the COVID-19, when I think the damage we're going to have to assess is also probably going to be very heavy on our small business community, particularly the ones who, have shops, the ones who are in industries where they have to be close to people, where they can't, they really had no option but to close down. These are the ones who might not have had the liquidable assets to start back up. So what can we do to retain what we have, and to also make sure that we can grow what we have? People who start with small businesses, as we all know, and they're usually those homegrown. They're already here in Wichita. They're something we want to keep. They're already investing in our community. So I would be interested to see if, echoing my colleague, if there is some policies that other cities are doing that we're comparable to, that we might be able to duplicate or create on our own. I'm sure in the next few months we're going to be able to assess the damage and see also how other areas have been able to handle this, and maybe we could take a lesson from that. Are there other comments at this time?
I have just a couple.
Vice Mayor.
I also want to talk a little bit about the small business assistance. I do think that's really important. We see a lot of that, but I also think when we're thinking about our CIDs and TIFs and maybe this this fee origination fee, that we think about projects that are helping really blighted and distressed areas. It just and I know sometimes developers don't want to work in those areas, but if we have incentives, that may help. And really the work that Councilmember Johnson's done in the opportunity zones, to be able to see some of that work has even got me more excited about some of these neighborhood-type projects. And then finally, I just really want to thank the work of the Economic Development Committee. It was really important work, so thank you, Councilmember Fry and Councilmember Blubaugh, if he can hear us, and the work of the rest of the committees. I know that it was a lot of work. You know, I went to they had a couple meetings where they brought us in and kind of brought us along, but I know it was a lot of work, and I really appreciate the work that my fellow council members did on that.
Andrew led the way. So.
Thank you, Andrew.
Well, we have a meeting at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, so we'll definitely.
We might still be here, so you can just go.
That'd be fine.
That's right.
Yeah, it'll be interesting for us to try to bring some alternatives forward on the origination fee, if that is something we're going to go forward with. Previous life, the state attached a requirement to TIF projects that were housing related and required a 10% set aside for affordable housing as part of any project. And so those are things, I mean, so it's not unheard of trying to divert some of those funds from, projects to meet a public policy need for low income and disadvantaged residents.
Yeah.
But we'll bring some options.
Yeah, I've seen some articles and research on using your TIF and CID funding to funnel those incentives into things that really fit with the direction of the city. And I think that's what I would like to see as we think about that. And not that we haven't, because we have. There's been things where we really wanted this developed and, to provide those incentives. But can we think about that in a bigger picture? I think that becomes really important, again, in some of our parts of town. So.
Any other comments? Mr. Manager, moving forward, can I make sure I get updates on the progress of the committee during our updates?
Of the committee?
Yeah, in the beginning, I asked about this committee and asked who the electeds were on it, and it's one of those things where I, as mayor, would like to stay up to date on, and since I don't have anyone to help me with that, I'm hoping you would, during our updates, could do that.
Andrew, do you keep minutes from those meetings? We can provide the agenda materials.
No, sir, yeah, but we can certainly provide updates for sure.
Okay.
Excellent. Well, maybe a briefing would be nice too. Any other comments? See none. We're adjourned. Barring no objections. Anonymous.
I object.
You don't want to sweat anymore? You want to keep sweating?
Yeah, I'm worried I have a COVID fever.
So.
Yeah, well,